Chapter 1. The Empty Bed. There's a moment I keep coming back to. Not a battle, not a death, something quieter. Shane Walsh standing outside a hospital room in King County, his hand pressed flat against glass that won't let him reach the person on the other side. 3 hours before he'll evacuate with Laurie and Carl. 2 hours before the military cordons collapse and the city burns. 1 hour before he'll stop being Deputy Walsh and become something else entirely. He's wearing Rick's watch. Shane took it from the bedside table that morning when the machine started failing. Not theft. Safekeeping. The kind of thing you do when someone you've loved since high school is dying and you need to carry something of them forward. The watch ticks against his wrist now, measuring time in a world where time still meant appointments and deadlines and visiting hours, where the dead stayed dead. What if Rick had never woken up? What if the man who would become the heart of everything that followed had simply slipped away in the chaos, leaving the people who loved him to find their own way through the end of the world? Tonight, let's follow that thread together. 3 weeks later, the watch still ticks on Shane's wrist. He doesn't wind it anymore, doesn't check it against the sun or count the hours between meals. But he hasn't taken it off either, and in the pre-dawn quiet of the Atlanta camp, when he's the only one awake and the fire has burned down to embers, he listens to the sound it makes, steady and persistent and completely disconnected from anything that matters now. Rick is dead. Shane knows this the way he knows which direction the walkers come from when the wind shifts. Not because he saw the body, not because he checked that abandoned hospital one more time, but because Rick would have found them by now. Rick would have torn Georgia apart, looking for his family, and the fact that he hasn't means there's nothing left of him to search. Shane sits on a fallen log, 20 yards from the cluster of tents and lean-tos that house what's left of their world. Carl and Laurie share the largest tent, positioned close enough to Shane's bedroll that he can hear if either of them calls out in their sleep. Laurie rarely does anymore. The nightmares that kept her awake those first 2 weeks have settled into something deeper, a grief she's learning to carry without drowning in it. Carl is different. 9 years old and asking questions Shane doesn't know how to answer. "When do you think Dad will find us?" Carl had asked yesterday while they were checking the perimeter wire for breaks. Not if. When. The boy's certainty about his father's survival cuts something inside Shane every time he hears it. Shane had knelt down to Carl's eye level, the way Rick always did when he needed to tell the boy something important. "I need you to listen to me careful, okay? Your dad would do anything to get back to you and your mum. Anything. But sometimes the world doesn't let people do what they want to do." Carl's face had shifted through confusion and understanding and something harder to name. Is he dead? The question Shane had been dreading for 21 days. The question he'd been preparing for and avoiding in equal measure. "I think maybe he is, buddy. I think maybe he got hurt too bad to come looking for us." Carl had nodded once, sharp and decisive, like he'd been waiting for someone to tell him what he already suspected. Then he'd gone back to checking the wire, and Shane had watched him work with hands that were steady and focused and far too adult for a 9-year-old's frame. That's the thing about Carl that keeps Shane awake some nights. The boy is processing his father's death the way Rick would have processed it. Practically, without drama, getting on with the business of staying alive because that's what the situation requires. It's like watching a ghost learn to walk. The camp stirs as the sun finds the tree line. Dale emerges from the RV first, moving with the careful precision of a man whose joints remind him every morning that he's 20 years older than anyone else here. He nods to Shane as he passes, a greeting that carries weight they haven't discussed. Dale knows about leadership, about the responsibility that settles on whoever can't sleep through the night, because they're too busy counting threats and calculating resources. Glenn crawls out of his tent next, already reaching for the backpack that holds his city gear. The boy's been running supply missions into Atlanta every other day, coming back with medicine and food, and occasionally something unexpected. Yesterday it was a coloring book for Sophia. The day before, batteries for Dale's radio. Small things that keep hope moving forward in a world designed to kill it. Morning, Shane. Glenn's voice carries the particular weariness of someone who's learned that every day you wake up alive is a surprise worth noting. Morning. You sure about going back in today? Glenn shrugs, but Shane catches the micro-hesitation before he answers. Store's still got supplies. Long as I can get in and out clean, makes sense to keep taking them. There it is. The calculation that defines everything now. Risk versus reward, weighed out in the context of how much food they have left and how many mouths need feeding. Shane wants to tell Glenn to take someone with him, but they both know the truth. Glenn moves through the city like water, finding gaps and routes that two people couldn't navigate. And if something goes wrong, better to lose one person than two. Shane's watch ticks against his wrist. 6:47 in the morning. In the old world, he'd be getting ready for shift change about now. Rick would be coming in to relieve him, coffee in hand, and some story about Carl's latest obsession or Laurie's latest worry. They'd spend 20 minutes going over what happened overnight, who needed watching, what problems were brewing. Then Shane would drive home to an empty apartment and sleep until it was time to do it again. Now Shane's shift never ends, and Rick isn't coming to relieve him. Laurie appears in the tent opening, her hair caught in the kind of tangle that speaks to difficult sleep. She looks around the camp with the systematic attention of someone checking to make sure everyone she's responsible for is still breathing. Her eyes find Shane last, and something in her expression shifts, not quite relief, but something in that direction. "Coffee?" she asks, though they both know what she's really asking. Yeah, coffee sounds good. They move toward the fire pit together, not touching, but conscious of each other's proximity in a way that's new and complicated. 3 weeks of shared survival has created an intimacy between them that has nothing to do with romance and everything to do with the fact that they're Carl's entire world now. Whatever they are to each other, they have to be it consistently, because the boy is watching and learning how adults hold together when everything falls apart. Laurie measures coffee grounds with the care of someone rationing medication. Every spoonful represents a choice between comfort now and comfort later, and she's gotten good at finding the balance that keeps morale up without burning through supplies too quickly. It's one of 100 small leadership decisions she's taken on without anyone asking her to. Shane watches her work and thinks about the conversation he had with Dale 3 days ago, about what happens when grief transforms into something else, about whether what's growing between him and Laurie is real or just the practical result of two people discovering they work well together in crisis. "You think he's really gone?" Laurie asks quietly, not looking up from the coffee pot. She's never asked this before. For 3 weeks, she's existed in the space between hope and acceptance, neither fully believing Rick is dead, nor acting like he's coming back. It occurs to Shane that this might be the first morning she's woken up without listening for his voice calling her name. "I think if he was alive, he'd be here," Shane says. "I think he'd have found a way." Laurie nods, but doesn't answer immediately. When she does, her voice carries a decision he can hear being made. "Carl asked me yesterday if you were going to be his dad now. Not replace his dad, just be his dad. Shane's chest tightens. The question he's been avoiding since the day they left King County. What did you tell him? That families get made lots of different ways, and that the people who take care of you and love you and stick around when things get hard, those people are your family, regardless of what you call them. The coffee starts to bubble, filling the morning air with a smell that tricks Shane's brain into thinking the world might be normal for just a moment. But the sound of Glenn loading his pack reminds him that normal is a luxury they can't afford. I can't be Rick, Shane says. I'm not asking you to be Rick. I'm asking if you want to be here, with us, for real. It's the closest thing to a proposal either of them is likely to get in a world where tomorrow isn't guaranteed. Not marriage exactly, but partnership. The practical arrangement that happens when two people realize they're stronger together than apart, and they care about the same things enough to build something around that caring. Shane looks at Carl, who's emerged from the tent and is helping Dale check the radio for any sign that other groups of survivors exist. The boy moves with purpose and concentration, doing the work that needs doing, because it needs doing, like his father would have. Yeah, Shane says. I want to be here. Laurie smiles, and for the first time since the world ended, it doesn't look like something she's forcing. Good. Because we need you. The watch ticks against Shane's wrist, measuring time that doesn't mean what it used to mean. But maybe that's okay. Maybe the point isn't to preserve the old definitions of time and family and responsibility. Maybe the point is to build new ones that work for the world they're actually living in. Rick is gone. But Carl and Laurie aren't. And Shane Walsh, who used to be a deputy in a place that doesn't exist anymore, is learning that sometimes love means stepping into the empty spaces left by the people who can't come home. Even when you're still wearing their watch, the sun clears the tree line, and another day of survival begins. Shane stands up, checks the perimeter one more time, and gets ready to be the man this family needs him to be. Not because it's easy, because it's necessary, and because love, in the end, is just another word for the choice to keep showing up. Chapter 2. The Supply Runner. There's a particular way Glenn Rhee moves when he's preparing for a run into the city. Not hurried exactly, but contained, like he's compressing himself into something smaller and faster and harder to catch. He checks his backpack 3 times, counts the water bottles twice, and always makes sure his baseball cap sits just right. Brim pulled low enough to shadow his eyes, but not so low it blocks his peripheral vision. Shane watches this ritual from across the camp and checks his watch without meaning to. 7:15 in the morning. Glenn's been gone 12 minutes past his usual departure time, which means something's shifted in the calculation that determines whether today feels safe enough for Atlanta. It's been 4 days since Shane told Laurie they were family now. 4 days since Carl stopped asking when his father was coming home. And in those 4 days, Glenn has made 3 runs into the city, each one lasting longer than the last and bringing back supplies that keep hope moving forward in a world designed to kill it. Yesterday he returned with antibiotics for Amy's infected cut and a solar radio that might help them reach other survivor groups. The day before that, baby formula for the infant in the Morales family and a manual on water purification that Dale read cover to cover by firelight. Small victories that add up to the difference between surviving and dying, delivered by a 22-year-old who's learning to navigate hell because someone has to, and he's fast enough to maybe make it back. But Glenn's been gone longer each time, and Shane's been checking his watch more often. He's getting reckless, Dale says quietly, settling beside Shane on the log that's become their unofficial command post. The older man's voice carries the weight of someone who's spent 70 years watching young people make dangerous choices for good reasons. Shane doesn't answer immediately. He's thinking about Rick, about the way Rick would have handled this. Rick would have insisted on backup, would have spent hours planning routes and escape strategies, would have found a way to minimize risk while maximizing return, because that's who Rick was. Someone who believed you could think your way around the worst outcomes if you just spent enough time considering the angles. But Rick isn't here, and Glenn is volunteering for runs that are getting more dangerous because the easy pickings in the city's outer edges are gone now. What's left requires going deeper into Walker territory, places where one wrong turn or one moment of bad luck could mean never coming home. He's keeping us alive, Shane says finally. For now. But what happens when his luck runs out? It's the question Shane's been avoiding for a week. The question that sits underneath every conversation about food supplies and medicine and ammunition. How much risk is one person's life worth when that person is the difference between the group eating and the group starving? Glenn shoulders his pack and walks over to where Shane and Dale are sitting. His face carries the focused expression of someone who's already mentally mapping his route, already thinking through contingencies and escape plans. But there's something else there too, a restlessness that wasn't present 2 weeks ago when he first started making supply runs. Pharmacy on Peachtree, Glenn says, without preamble. Amy's fever isn't breaking, and we're almost out of acetaminophen. Place should have what we need if I can get past the walkers in the parking area. Shane's chest tightens. The Peachtree Pharmacy is 8 blocks deeper into the city than Glenn's been before. 8 blocks closer to the heart of Atlanta, where the walker herds are thickest and the escape routes are most limited. That's pretty far in, Shane says, trying to keep his voice neutral. It's where the medicine is. Glenn's tone carries the finality of someone who's already made his decision and isn't interested in discussing alternatives. Shane checks his watch. 7:17. In the old world, he'd be getting ready for shift change. Rick would be walking through the door with coffee and updates about what happened overnight. They'd spend 20 minutes talking through the day ahead, making sure every base was covered before Shane headed home to sleep. Now Shane's making life and death decisions about a 22-year-old who's become essential to everyone's survival, and there's no one coming to relieve him of that responsibility. Take someone with you, Shane says. You know I work better alone. 2 people make twice as much noise, move half as fast. If something goes wrong, it's easier for one person to hide than 2. Glenn's right, and they both know it. He's been successful precisely because he operates like water, finding gaps and routes that larger groups couldn't navigate. Adding backup might make Shane feel better, but it would make Glenn less effective and potentially more vulnerable. How long? Shane asks. 4 hours. Maybe 5, if the pharmacy's more picked over than I think. Shane nods, but something in his expression makes Glenn pause. The younger man studies Shane's face with the kind of attention that comes from learning to read situations quickly and accurately. You think I shouldn't go? It's not a question. Glenn's gotten good at reading the micro-expressions that reveal what people are really thinking. It's part of what makes him effective in the city, the ability to assess threats and opportunities faster than the threats can assess him. Shane considers lying, considers finding a diplomatic way to express his concerns. But there's something about Glenn's direct question that deserves a direct answer. I think you're pushing harder than you need to, taking risks that are getting bigger every time. Amy's going to die if she doesn't get medicine. And you're going to die if you keep going deeper into the city without backup or better intel, or some kind of plan that doesn't rely on luck and speed. The words hang in the morning air between them. Around the camp, people are starting their daily routines, checking snares, tending the fire, organizing supplies, the domestic rhythm of survival that continues regardless of the bigger questions about risk and responsibility and how much one person should be asked to carry. Glenn shifts his weight, and Shane catches a glimpse of something underneath the confident exterior. Uncertainty, maybe. Or exhaustion. The kind of bone-deep tiredness that comes from being essential to everyone's survival and not being sure how long you can sustain that level of responsibility. You want me to stop making runs? I want you to make runs that don't require luck to work. I want you to have backup plans that don't depend on outrunning walkers. I want... Shane pauses, hearing the echo of every conversation he ever had with Rick about officer safety and acceptable risk. I want you to come home every time you go out there. Glenn's expression softens slightly. For just a moment, he looks like what he is. A young man who's been asked to carry more weight than any 22-year-old should have to carry. Amy's temperature hit 103 this morning, Glenn says quietly. Andrea's trying not to panic, but she's scared, really scared, and we don't have anything left that'll bring a fever down. Shane checks his watch again. 7:20. The conversation has taken longer than usual, which means Glenn's departure is delayed, which means his return time will shift accordingly. Every variable matters when you are measuring someone's survival in increments of time. Okay, Shane says finally, but we do it different this time. You take the walkie. Check in every 30 minutes. If you miss a check-in, Dale and I are coming after you. Glenn nods, understanding that this is Shane's compromise between necessary risk and unacceptable loss. It's not perfect protection, but it's something. A tether that connects Glenn to the people who need him to survive this run, and all the runs that will follow. 30 minutes, Glenn agrees. And Shane? If I don't make it back, Amy's going to need something else for that fever. There's aspirin in the first aid kit from the RV. Not as good as acetaminophen for kids, but better than nothing. Shane wants to tell Glenn not to talk like that, wants to insist that thinking about failure makes failure more likely, but he recognizes the practical planning that drives Glenn's comment. The same instinct that makes Glenn effective in the city makes him think through contingencies that other people would rather ignore. You'll make it back, Shane says. Yeah, I will. Glenn adjusts his pack one final time and heads toward the tree line that marks the boundary between the camp and the outside world. He moves with the loose-jointed confidence of someone who's learned to trust his body to carry him through situations his mind can't fully prepare for. Shane watches until Glenn disappears into the trees, then checks his watch and makes a mental note. 7:23. 4 hours from now, Glenn should be walking back into camp with medicine for Amy and stories about whatever he encountered in the city. 5 hours from now, if something's gone wrong, Shane will have decisions to make about rescue missions and acceptable losses and how much risk the group can absorb to save one person. Dale settles back beside Shane on the log. Neither man speaks immediately. Around them, the camp continues its morning routine, but there's a particular quality to the quiet now, the suspended attention that happens when everyone's thinking about the same person without talking about it. He's getting good at this, Dale says eventually. Too good. That's what worries me. Shane thinks about Rick again, about the way Rick approached dangerous situations with methodical planning and careful backup, and always an escape route that didn't depend on everything going perfectly. Glenn operates on instinct and speed and a kind of practical fearlessness that works right up until it doesn't. But Rick isn't here to provide tactical guidance, and Glenn is keeping everyone alive with runs that require exactly the kind of calculated risk-taking that Rick would have found alternatives for. Shane's job isn't to be Rick. His job is to keep this group together, using whatever tools and people and strategies are actually available. Even when that means watching a 22-year-old disappear into the ruins of Atlanta with a backpack and a prayer and the weight of everyone's survival on his shoulders. Shane's watch ticks against his wrist. 7:25. The day is just beginning, and already he's counting minutes until the most important person in their group's survival comes home safely. Or doesn't. Chapter 3. The Teacher's Burden. There's a sound that carries farther than it should in the early morning hours, when the air is still and the world holds its breath between night and dawn, the sound of strangers calling for help. Dale Horvath hears it first from his position on watch, sitting in the driver's seat of the RV with the door cracked open and Shane's watch, borrowed for the night shift, ticking quietly against the dashboard. 3:47 in the morning. The voices are coming from the direction of the highway, maybe half a mile east of camp. A woman calling someone's name, over and over. A child crying. The particular quality of desperation that happens when people realize they're alone in a world that wants them dead. Dale's first instinct is to wake Shane. His second is to grab the binoculars and see if he can spot whoever's out there. His third, the one that settles in his chest and stays there, is to wonder what Rick Grimes would have done in this situation. Rick, who never met a stranger he wouldn't try to help. Rick, who believed that maintaining humanity meant taking risks for people you didn't know. Rick, who isn't here to make this decision. Dale checks the watch again. 3:50. The voices are getting closer, which means whoever's out there is moving toward the camp, moving toward the light of their fire and the promise of safety that a group of survivors represents. In 10 minutes, maybe 15, they'll be close enough to see the camp clearly, close enough to call out directly to the people who might save them or might decide they're too dangerous to help. What do you do when the world has ended and someone asks you to choose between compassion and security? When helping strangers might mean endangering the people you've already promised to protect. Dale climbs down from the RV as quietly as possible and makes his way to Shane's bedroll. The younger man sleeps the way cops sleep, alert, even unconscious, ready to wake up fully functional at the slightest unusual sound. Dale touches his shoulder once, and Shane's eyes open immediately. What is it? Voices, coming from the highway. Woman and child, sounds like. They're heading this way. Shane sits up, instantly focused. Dale can see him processing the information, running calculations about threat versus opportunity, risk versus responsibility. It's the same expression Shane wore yesterday when Glenn proposed the pharmacy run. The face of someone who's learned that every decision carries consequences, and some consequences are irreversible. How far out? Maybe 10 minutes. 15 if they're moving careful. Shane nods and reaches for his clothes. Wake Glenn and Andrea. Quietly. Everyone else stays asleep unless we need them. Dale wants to ask what Shane's planning. Wants to know if they're preparing to help these strangers or preparing to hide from them. But something in Shane's demeanor suggests that question will be answered soon enough, and asking it now might influence the answer in ways Dale isn't sure he wants. They wake Glenn and Andrea with whispered words and gentle touches. Both respond with the instant alertness of people who've learned that unexpected nighttime conversations usually mean danger. Within minutes, The 4 of them are crouched near the tree line that provides cover between the camp and the highway. The voices are clearer now. A woman calling for someone named Marcus. A child, young, maybe 5 or 6, asking repeatedly when they can stop walking. The exhausted cadence of people who've been moving for too long without rest or food or hope. There, Glenn whispers, pointing toward a gap in the trees. Dale follows his gesture and sees them. A woman in her 30s, carrying a backpack that's too big for her frame, and supporting a child who's clearly reached the end of his endurance. She moves with the careful attention of someone scanning constantly for threats, but also with the desperate forward motion of someone who knows staying in one place means death. They're maybe 50 yards from the camp perimeter, close enough that the woman will see their fire in the next few minutes, close enough that turning them away will require a conversation, explanations, the kind of human interaction that makes moral choices personal rather than abstract. Shane studies them through the binoculars for a long moment before passing them to Dale. What do you see? Dale adjusts the focus and watches the woman carefully. She's tired but alert, armed. There's a pistol in a holster at her hip, but not holding it. Moving toward their camp with the hope of desperate people, not the caution of predators. I see a mother trying to keep her child alive, Dale says, quietly. I see 2 more mouths to feed, and 2 more people to protect, Shane responds. And we don't know what they're running from or who might be following them. It's not cruelty that drives Shane's calculation. Dale understands that. It's the mathematics of survival in a world where resources are limited and threats are constant. Every decision to help someone outside the group is also a decision to potentially risk everyone inside it. But mathematics isn't the only factor worth considering. What would Rick have done? Dale asks. Shane's expression shifts, and for a moment Dale sees something vulnerable underneath the practical leadership mask. Pain, maybe, or recognition of a question that doesn't have an easy answer. Rick would have found a way to help them, Shane says finally. Rick always found a way to help everyone. But Rick isn't here to deal with the consequences when help turns into a problem we can't solve. The woman has spotted their fire. Dale can see her change direction, moving more purposefully now toward the camp. In 5 minutes, maybe less, she'll be close enough to call out, close enough to put a human face on the choice between compassion and security. We could share our breakfast, Andrea suggests quietly. Give them some water and directions to the highway. Help without taking them in. Glenn nods. There's that settlement rumor about Macon, 40 miles south. If they're looking for people, that might be a better option than us anyway. Dale checks Shane's watch. 4:07. In the old world, this would be the dead middle of night shift, the time when nothing important happened and the biggest decision was whether to make another pot of coffee. Now it's the moment when 4 people have to decide whether strangers live or die, and there's no policy manual that covers the right choice. Shane looks at each of them, reading their faces with the attention of someone who's learned that group leadership means understanding what your people can live with and what they can't. We help them, he says finally. Food, water, information. But they don't stay. Can't stay. We're already pushing the limits of what this location can support. Dale feels something tight in his chest loosen slightly. Not relief, exactly, but recognition that Shane's pragmatism doesn't exclude compassion entirely, that the man who's stepped into Rick's leadership role hasn't become someone Rick wouldn't recognize. I'll talk to her, Dale says, less threatening if it's the old man who approaches first. Shane nods, understanding the psychology behind Dale's suggestion. Dale has the face and demeanor of someone's grandfather, someone who represents safety rather than threat. If they're going to have this conversation, better to have it with the person least likely to trigger a defensive response. Dale walks toward the woman with his hands visible and his movements slow and deliberate. She spots him when he's 20 yards away and stops walking, positioning herself between Dale and the child with the automatic protectiveness of a parent in dangerous territory. "Morning," Dale says when he's close enough to speak without raising his voice. "Looks like you folks could use some help." The woman's face is a careful mask of hope and wariness. "We're looking for people. Safe people. My son and I have been walking for 3 days. Where from?" "Stone Mountain. Had a group there until the walkers found us. Most everyone." She doesn't finish the sentence, but she doesn't need to. Dale has heard enough similar stories to understand what happened. The child looks up at Dale with the particular exhaustion of a 5-year-old who's been asked to endure more than any child should endure. His clothes are dirty and too big for his frame, and he clutches a stuffed animal that's seen better days. "We've got some food we can share," Dale says, "and water. There's word of a settlement south of here, Macon. Might be what you're looking for." The woman's expression shifts from wariness to something approaching relief. Not complete trust, but recognition that this conversation might end with help rather than rejection. "We haven't eaten since yesterday morning," she admits. Dale thinks about the breakfast supplies back at camp, the carefully rationed coffee and the oatmeal that represents 1 day's worth of morning nutrition for 13 people. Sharing it means everyone eats a little less, means the gap between current supplies and the next supply run gets a little wider. But it also means a child doesn't go hungry. It means treating strangers like human beings rather than potential threats. It means making the choice that preserves something worth preserving, even when preservation requires sacrifice. "Come on back to camp," Dale says. "We'll get you fed and pointed in the right direction." As they walk toward the fire together, Dale checks Shane's watch one more time. 4:15 in the morning. The decision is made, and now comes the harder part, living with the consequences of choosing compassion over security, humanity over pure survival mathematics. Shane emerges from the trees as they approach camp, and Dale watches the woman's reaction to seeing a man in his 30s who moves like a cop and carries himself like someone accustomed to making hard decisions. Her wariness returns, but it's tempered by the fact that Dale has already extended help. "Shane Walsh," Shane says simply, extending his hand. "Sarah, this is my son Marcus." Shane kneels down to Marcus's eye level with the same instinct Dale has seen him use with Carl. "Hey there, Marcus. You hungry?" Marcus nods, and Dale sees something in Shane's expression soften. The recognition that children represent hope, even in the middle of survival calculations. The choosing to help a 5-year-old is never really about mathematics. By the time the sun clears the tree line, Sarah and Marcus are fed and rested and equipped with directions to Macon and enough supplies to get them there safely. They leave with thanks and the kind of gratitude that comes from unexpected kindness in a world where kindness has become rare. Dale watches them disappear into the morning light and thinks about the choice they made. Not the perfect choice. There are no perfect choices anymore. But a human choice. The kind of choice that preserves something worth preserving, even when preservation costs more than pure survival would require. Shane settles beside him on the log that's become their unofficial command post. "Think they'll make it?" "I think they have a better chance now than they did 4 hours ago." Shane nods, and for a moment they sit in comfortable silence. Around them, the camp is beginning its morning routine. Glenn checking his gear for another supply run. Laurie making coffee with the careful attention of someone rationing precious resources. Carl helping Dale organize the medical supplies. The domestic rhythm of survival continues. But something has shifted in the 4 hours between midnight and dawn. A precedent has been set about who they are as a group, about the balance between survival and humanity, about the choices they're willing to make when strangers ask for help. Dale checks Shane's watch one more time. 7:30. Time to return it to its owner and get ready for another day of keeping people alive in a world designed to kill them. But also time to remember that keeping people alive isn't just about food and water and protection from walkers. It's about maintaining the parts of humanity worth preserving, even when preservation requires sacrifice. Even when the person who would have made these choices naturally isn't there to make them anymore. Chapter 4. Breaking Point. There's a particular sound that broken glass makes when a man kicks it repeatedly against concrete. Sharp and persistent and completely unnecessary. Jim's been at it for 20 minutes now, standing beside the highway overpass, where he found the remains of what used to be a car window, driving his boot into the shards with the methodical intensity of someone who's forgotten that noise carries in a world where being heard means being found. Shane checks his watch. 2:15 in the afternoon. The sound has been echoing off the overpass walls and traveling farther than anything should travel when your survival depends on staying quiet, far enough to reach whatever's been moving through the tree line all morning, far enough to announce to every walker within a mile radius that live people are here, making noise, acting like the world is still safe enough for broken glass and raised voices. Jim hasn't spoken coherently in 3 days, hasn't slept in longer than that. Dale thinks it's grief. Jim lost his wife and daughters in the first week of the outbreak, watched them die in their suburban kitchen while he hid in the pantry. Andrea thinks it's exhaustion, the kind of bone-deep tiredness that comes from running on adrenaline too long. Shane thinks it's something worse, something that happens to a mind when reality becomes too heavy to carry and the only alternative is to stop processing the world accurately. What do you do when someone you've promised to protect becomes a threat to everyone else you've promised to protect? When keeping them alive might mean getting everyone killed? Jim. Shane's voice carries the particular patience of someone who's tried reasoning and is running out of alternatives. Jim, we need you to stop. Jim looks up from the broken glass, and for a moment his eyes focus with something approaching recognition. Then he smiles. The wrong kind of smile, the kind that suggests he's seeing something other people can't see, and kicks the glass again. The sound echoes, and from the tree line, maybe half a mile out, comes an answering sound. The particular moan that means walkers have heard something interesting and are moving toward it with the persistent determination of hunger given direction. Shane's chest tightens. He looks toward the camp where Laurie is helping Carl with schoolwork on the picnic table they salvaged from a rest stop, where Glenn is organizing supplies for tomorrow's run into the city, where Dale is reading to Sophia from a book about horses that used to belong to Amy before Amy died last week. Normal life continuing in a bubble of pretended safety, while the sound of Jim's breakdown draws death toward everyone Shane has sworn to keep alive. Dale, Shane calls quietly. The older man looks up from the book and immediately understands. He sets it aside and walks over with the careful attention of someone who's learned to read danger in other people's expressions. How close? Dale asks. Close enough. And getting closer. Shane watches Jim kick the glass again, harder this time, with the focused energy of someone who's found a task he can understand when nothing else makes sense anymore. We need to move, now. What about Jim? It's the question Shane's been avoiding for 3 days. The question that sits underneath every conversation about supplies and routes and how far they can push before something breaks. Jim can't travel safely, can't follow orders, can't be trusted to stay quiet when noise means death. But he's also someone they've shared meals with, someone who helped Dale fix the RV engine last week, someone who used to tell stories about his daughters that made Carl laugh. Shane checks his watch again. 2:17. The moaning is getting closer, and with it comes the sound of movement through underbrush. Multiple walkers, maybe a dozen, maybe more, drawn by 20 minutes of broken glass and the promise of warm meat making noise. We can't take him with us, Shane says quietly. And we can't stay here. Dale's face shifts through understanding and resistance. There has to be something we can do. Some way to reach him. He's gone, Dale. Whatever Jim used to be, he's not that anymore. And keeping him around is going to get everyone killed. From across the camp, Laurie looks up from Carl's schoolwork and sees Shane and Dale in conversation. She reads the tension in their postures, the way they're standing too close together and talking too quietly. She stands up and walks over with the careful attention of someone who's learned that whispered conversations usually mean bad news. What's happening? Jim's drawn walkers, Shane says simply. We need to evacuate. Now. Laurie looks at Jim, who's moved from kicking glass to picking up individual pieces and throwing them as hard as he can against the concrete wall. Each impact creates a sharp crack that echoes farther than it should. Each sound like a dinner bell for everything dead within hearing range. He doesn't know what he's doing, Laurie says. Doesn't matter. Results the same either way. Shane starts moving toward the camp, calling out in the calm, authoritative voice he's learned to use when panic needs to be controlled. Everyone pack up. 5 minutes. Take what you can carry. Leave everything else. The response is immediate and efficient. Glenn abandons the supply organization and starts grabbing essentials. Dale folds the book and helps Sophia gather her few belongings. Andrea and Amy begin breaking down their shared tent with practiced speed. Carl looks up from his schoolwork with the alert attention of a 9-year-old who's learned that sudden changes in adult behavior usually mean danger. Are we leaving? Yeah, buddy, Shane says, kneeling down to Carl's eye level, the way he's learned to do when delivering information the boy needs to hear, but won't like. We've got some walkers heading this way. Time to find somewhere new. Carl nods and begins collecting his books with the automatic compliance of a child who's learned that questioning orders takes time they might not have. But he glances toward Jim, still throwing glass, and Shane catches something in the boy's expression that looks like understanding. What about Jim? Carl asks. It's the question Shane hoped Carl wouldn't ask. The question that forces him to choose between honesty and protection, between preparing the boy for the world they're actually living in and preserving what's left of childhood innocence. Shane looks at Laurie, checking for permission or prohibition. She nods slightly, the kind of nod that means she trusts his judgment, even when his judgment requires saying things no child should have to hear. Jim's sick, Carl. Really sick. And sometimes when people get sick like Jim is sick, they can't travel with other people anymore. Carl processes this information with the careful attention Shane has learned to expect from him. Are we going to leave him here? Shane wants to lie, wants to find some gentle way to frame what's about to happen that doesn't require a 9-year-old to understand that sometimes survival means abandoning people who can't contribute to everyone's safety anymore. But Carl is watching him with Rick's eyes, and Rick never lied to his son about important things. Yeah, We're going to leave him here. Carl nods once, accepting the information without argument. But Shane catches something in the boy's face that looks like loss. Not just of Jim, but of the idea that the adults in his life can protect everyone worth protecting. The moaning is close enough now to distinguish individual voices. Shane counts at least 15, maybe 20 walkers moving through the trees toward the sound of breaking glass. In 10 minutes, maybe less, they'll emerge from the tree line and find the camp. Time to go, Shane announces. The evacuation happens with practiced efficiency. 5 weeks of survival have taught everyone what's essential and what can be left behind. Dale starts the RV engine, while Glenn and Andrea secure the remaining supplies. Laurie helps Carl gather his schoolwork and the few toys that represent continuity with the world before. Jim doesn't notice the activity around him. He's moved on from throwing glass to talking to someone who isn't there, having a conversation with his dead wife about dinner plans and weekend activities. For just a moment, watching him, Shane sees who Jim used to be. A father and husband who worried about mortgage payments and his daughter's math grades. Someone who lived in a world where the biggest decision was whether to cook dinner at home or order pizza. That man is gone. Has been gone for days. What's left is something that looks like Jim but can't function as Jim, can't be relied upon or reasoned with or kept safe without endangering everyone else. Shane walks over to where Jim stands beside the glass-covered concrete. Jim, we're leaving now. Jim looks up with the unfocused attention of someone hearing voices from very far away. My wife says I should clean this up before the neighbors complain. Yeah, Shane says quietly. You should definitely clean it up. Jim nods and returns to his task, satisfied that someone understands what needs to be done. Shane watches him for a moment longer, then turns and walks toward the RV, where everyone else is waiting. Carl is sitting in the passenger seat, looking back toward Jim through the side mirror. Shane sees the boy process what's happening, the abandonment of someone who was part of their group, the practical mathematics of survival that requires leaving people behind when they become liabilities. It's the kind of lesson Rick would have shielded Carl from for as long as possible, the kind of harsh reality Rick would have found alternatives for, or at least found ways to frame as temporary rather than final. But Rick isn't here to provide those alternatives or that framing. Shane climbs into the driver's seat and starts the engine. In the mirror, he can see Jim still working at the broken glass, while the first walkers emerge from the tree line 50 yards behind him. Jim doesn't notice them, doesn't run, just continues his task of cleaning up the mess, talking to his dead wife about neighborhood concerns and family dinner plans. Where are we going? Laurie asks from the seat behind Shane. Shane thinks about the radio conversations Dale picked up last week, fragments of military broadcasts and emergency protocols, references to the CDC and containment procedures, and possible solutions to problems that don't have names yet. CDC, Shane says. Atlanta. Dr. Jenner's supposed to be working on something there. Answers maybe, or at least somewhere safer than here. Dale nods from the back of the RV. CDC's got military protection. Might be our best shot at finding people who know what they're doing. As they pull away from the camp, Shane checks his watch one final time. 2:23 in the afternoon. The decision is made, and there's no going back to change it. No alternative ending where everyone gets saved and every person who needs protection receives it. In the side mirror, Shane watches the walkers reach Jim, who greets them with the same confused friendliness he's been showing everyone for the past 3 days. The glass continues to crunch under his feet until it doesn't. Carl doesn't look away from the mirror until Jim disappears entirely behind the trees and distance. When he finally turns around, his face carries an expression Shane recognizes. The look of someone who's learned that survival sometimes requires choices no one should have to make. "Is the CDC going to be different?" Carl asks. Shane wants to promise that it will be. Wants to tell the boy that there are still places in the world where difficult decisions aren't necessary, where adults can protect everyone worth protecting without having to choose between competing loyalties. But Rick isn't here to provide those assurances, and Shane has learned that false hope can be more dangerous than honest uncertainty. "I don't know," Shane tells Carl, "but it's got to be better than this." The RV moves toward Atlanta, and whatever answers or false promises the CDC might provide. Behind them, the abandoned campsite grows smaller in the mirror until it disappears entirely, taking with it the last pretense that this group can afford to save everyone who needs saving. Shane's watch ticks against his wrist, measuring time in a world where time means distance from the choices that can't be undone. Miles between the people they used to be and the people survival has required them to become. Chapter 5. Whispers of Hope. There's a particular quality to artificial light that makes everything look temporary, like a stage set waiting to be struck when the show ends. Dr. Edwin Jenner's laboratory at the CDC carries that same theatrical unreality. Too bright, too clean, too much like the world before to feel sustainable in a world where sustainability has become the only currency that matters. Shane checks his watch. 11:47 at night. 13 hours since they arrived at the CDC's reinforced doors with nothing but hope and desperation. 12 hours since Dr. Jenner let them in with the weary resignation of a man who's been alone too long. 6 hours since dinner and wine and the first hot shower any of them had experienced since the world ended. 1 hour since Dr. Jenner told them the truth about what they're all carrying inside their skulls. The brain remains active after death, Jenner had said, displaying the brain scans with the clinical detachment of someone who's moved past emotional responses to apocalyptic revelations. But only the brain stem, the parts that control basic motor functions. What dies is the frontal cortex, everything that made the person who they were. Shane thinks about Jim, left behind at the overpass with walkers closing in and broken glass crunching under his feet. Jim, who spent his final hours having conversations with his dead wife about neighborhood concerns and family dinner plans. Maybe the frontal cortex had already been dying before the walkers found him. Maybe what Shane had seen wasn't breakdown, but preview. The group sits in the CDC's main lab, processing Jenner's words with the stunned attention of people learning that hope was built on misunderstanding. Around the room, faces reflect different stages of acceptance. Dale, methodical and thoughtful, asking follow-up questions about timeline and transmission. Glenn, practical as always, wanting to know if there's anything they can do to prevent or delay infection. Andrea sits apart from the others, her face carrying the particular emptiness that comes from learning that death isn't an ending, but a transformation. That Amy, sweet, optimistic Amy, who died saving Sophia from a walker 3 days ago, is still out there somewhere, wearing Amy's face, but carrying none of Amy's gentleness. What about immunity? Dale asks. Have you found anyone who doesn't carry the infection? Jenner shakes his head with the patience of someone who's already considered every possible alternative. Everyone's infected. Everyone will turn when they die, regardless of cause. It's not a matter of exposure or transmission anymore. It's biology. Shane watches Carl process this information with the careful attention he's learned to expect from the boy. 9 years old, and calculating the implications of inevitable transformation, understanding that every person he cares about will eventually become something that wants to kill him. Rick would have had questions about transmission rates and incubation periods and research protocols. Rick would have pushed for details about genetic markers and potential treatments, and whether anyone, anywhere, was working on solutions that might matter. But Rick isn't here to ask those questions, and Shane doesn't have the background knowledge to know which questions would lead to useful answers. Instead, Shane asks the question that matters for keeping people alive tomorrow. How much time do we have? Here? Until the generators run out of fuel. 48 hours, maybe less. Then the facility goes into lockdown protocols and... Jenna doesn't finish the sentence, but the implication hangs in the air like smoke. Shane checks his watch again. 11:51. 47 hours until the building becomes a tomb with all of them sealed inside it. 47 hours to process the truth about infection and mortality, and the fact that everyone they've lost is still walking around somewhere, just not as anyone they'd recognize. Laurie moves closer to Shane on the couch, not quite touching, but close enough that he can feel the heat of her proximity. Her face carries the expression of someone who's learned to love carefully, in a world where love means eventual loss, but who's decided that careful love is still worth having. "What do we do?" she asks quietly. It's the question Shane's been avoiding since Jenna started talking about brain stems and motor functions. The question that sits underneath every practical consideration about fuel and lockdown protocols and escape routes. What do you do when you learn that hope was based on incomplete information, that survival is just delayed transformation, that everything you've been fighting for ends the same way regardless? Shane thinks about Carl, sleeping in one of the CDC's residential quarters with the first sense of security he's experienced since the world ended. About Glenn, already planning tomorrow's supply run to the city. About Dale, treating the infection revelation like a puzzle to be solved, rather than a death sentence to be accepted. "We keep going," Shane says simply. Andrea looks up from her isolated corner, her eyes carrying the particular hollowness that comes from losing the only person who made survival feel worthwhile. "Why? If we're all going to turn anyway, why not just stop?" It's the question Dale has been preparing for since they arrived. Shane can see it in the older man's expression, the recognition that Andrea's grief has transformed into something dangerous, something that might offer relief but would end everything worth preserving. Dale settles beside Andrea on the couch with the careful attention of someone approaching a wounded animal. Because the time between now and then still matters. Because Carl deserves to grow up as much as possible before he has to face what we all face. Because Amy would want you to keep going. "Amy's dead," Andrea says, with the finality of someone who's moved past hope into acceptance. "Amy's been dead for 3 days, and we left her in a field to walk around as one of those things. So no, Dale, Amy doesn't want anything anymore." Shane watches the conversation unfold and thinks about Rick, about the way Rick would have handled Andrea's despair. Rick had a gift for finding the words that made people want to keep fighting even when fighting seemed pointless. Rick understood how to balance honesty about the world's cruelty with hope about what could still be preserved. But Rick isn't here, and Shane's gifts run toward practical leadership rather than inspirational speeches. "You want to die. That's your choice," Shane says to Andrea, his voice carrying the particular directness he's learned to use when diplomacy would take too long. But Carl's been through enough loss without watching another person he cares about give up. So if you're going to make that choice, make it away from him. It's not the gentle persuasion Dale would prefer, not the compassionate understanding that Rick would have offered. But it's honest, and it connects Andrea's decision to consequences beyond her own pain. Andrea studies Shane's face for a long moment, reading something in his expression that makes her nod slightly. Not agreement exactly, but recognition that her choices affect more people than just herself. When this place shuts down, Andrea asks, where do we go? Shane thinks about the conversations he's had with Dale about rumors and radio fragments, stories about settlements south of Atlanta, communities that might have found ways to survive that don't depend on CDC generators or military protection. South, Shane says. Dale picked up radio chatter about a farm maybe 40 miles from here. People taking in survivors, offering protection. Might be worth investigating. Jenner looks up from his computer terminal, where he's been monitoring the countdown to system shutdown. I wouldn't count on settlements lasting much longer. What's happening here? The power grid failing, infrastructure collapsing. It's happening everywhere. The world you're looking for doesn't exist anymore. Shane checks his watch. 11:58. 46 hours until lockdown. Until the choice between staying and dying or leaving and facing the world with the knowledge that everyone's infected. That death is just transformation delayed. Maybe not, Shane says, but Carl doesn't know that yet. And as long as he doesn't know it, there's still something worth protecting. Laurie reaches over and takes Shane's hand, her fingers intertwining with his, with the natural ease of people who've learned to love each other through shared responsibility rather than shared romance. It's not the passionate love of movies and fairy tales, but it's something more practical and maybe more durable. The love that happens when two people discover they work well together in crisis and they care about the same things enough to build something around that caring. Shane looks at their joined hands and thinks about Rick's watch, still ticking against his wrist after 6 weeks of measuring time in a world where time doesn't mean what it used to mean. Rick is gone, has been gone since before any of them understood what gone really meant. But Carl and Laurie aren't gone. The group isn't gone, despite the losses and the abandonment and the knowledge that infection waits inside all of them. Maybe that's enough. Maybe the point isn't to prevent the inevitable transformation, but to make the time before transformation mean something. To keep Carl safe and fed and loved for as long as possible. To give Glenn and Dale and even Andrea reasons to keep moving forward, even when forward leads toward the same destination, regardless. Around the room, the group settles into whatever peace they can find with Jenna's revelations. Dale continues asking questions about research protocols and global responses. Glenn starts planning evacuation routes and supply needs. Carl sleeps in safety for what might be the last time in his life. Shane checks his watch one final time. Midnight exactly. 46 hours until they have to choose between staying and dying, or leaving and facing the world with the truth about what they're carrying inside their skulls. But for now, in this bright, temporary space that feels like a stage set waiting to be struck, they have clean sheets and hot water and each other. They have time to rest and plan and prepare for whatever comes after the CDC's protection ends. Shane squeezes Laurie's hand and listens to his watch tick away minutes that might be precious or might be irrelevant, depending on how you calculate value in a world where everyone's infected, but some people are still worth saving anyway. The artificial light continues to make everything look temporary. But temporary, Shane is learning, doesn't mean worthless. Sometimes temporary is exactly long enough. Chapter 6. The Road to Herschel's. There's a particular sound a child makes when a bullet tears through their abdomen. Not a scream exactly, but something smaller and more surprised. Carl makes that sound at 2:37 in the afternoon while chasing a deer through the woods outside what will become, in the next few desperate hours, either his salvation or his grave. Shane reaches him first, dropping to his knees beside the boy with the practiced efficiency of someone who's seen gunshot wounds before, but never on someone who calls him Dad. Carl's eyes are wide and focused on Shane's face, with the particular trust that comes from 9 years of believing the adults in your life can fix whatever breaks. "Shane," Carl whispers, his voice carrying the thin quality that means shock is setting in. "It hurts." Shane checks his watch without thinking. 2:39. In the old world, this would be shift change time, the moment when Rick would walk through the door and take over whatever problems the day had generated. Now Shane presses his hands against Carl's abdomen, trying to slow the bleeding while calculating distances to medical care and odds of survival, and whether the gunshot will draw walkers or other survivors. "I know it hurts, buddy, but you're going to be okay. I promise." It's the kind of promise Shane would never have made to anyone else. Too absolute, too dependent on variables he can't control. But Carl isn't anyone else. Carl is the boy who's been calling him Dad for the past month, who does homework at the kitchen table Shane built from salvaged wood, who falls asleep most nights listening to Shane read stories about better worlds where children don't get shot while chasing deer through dangerous woods. Laurie appears through the trees, moving with the particular speed that means she's heard gunshots and is calculating worst-case scenarios. When she sees Carl on the ground with Shane's hands covered in blood, her face goes through every stage of parental panic before settling on the focused calm that emergencies require. "How bad?" she asks. "Bad enough. He needs a doctor. Real medical care, not just first aid." The voice that answers comes from behind them, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being listened to in medical situations. "I'm a veterinarian. It's not the same as human medicine, but it's better than nothing." Shane looks up to see a man in his 60s, holding a hunting rifle with the comfortable familiarity of someone who grew up when owning guns was normal rather than necessary. Behind him stands a younger man, maybe 25, with the kind of face that suggests he'd rather be anywhere else than watching a child bleed in the woods. "Herschel Green," the older man says simply. "This is my land. My son Otis was hunting, heard the shot. We came to investigate." Shane wants to ask if Otis was the one who shot Carl, wants to demand explanations and accountability, and someone to blame for the fact that the most important person in his world is bleeding in the dirt. But Carl needs medical attention more than Shane needs someone to be angry at. "Your farm," Shane says. "How close?" "Half-mile through the woods. I've got medical supplies, surgical equipment, enough to stabilize him for transport." Shane lifts Carl as carefully as possible, feeling the boy's weight settle against his chest with the particular trust that comes from believing Shane can carry him through anything. Carl's breathing is shallow but steady, his eyes still focused and aware. "Stay with me, buddy," Shane murmurs, as they move through the trees toward whatever hope Herschel's farm might offer. "Stay right here with me." The farmhouse appears through the trees like something from a world that ended 6 months ago. White clapboard siding, wraparound porch, the kind of domestic normalcy that makes Shane's chest tighten with recognition of everything they've lost. But there's also something else. Other people. A woman in her 40s directing activity from the porch steps. 2 younger women organizing medical supplies. A teenage boy helping an elderly man toward what looks like a barn, a community, a functioning group that's found a way to live rather than just survive. Shane carries Carl up the porch steps, while Herschel calls out instructions to people who respond with the efficiency of a family that's learned to work together in crisis. Within minutes, Carl is laid out on a kitchen table converted to operating theatre, with Herschel examining the wound while Shane holds the boy's hand and watches colour drain from Carl's face. "The bullet's still in there," Herschel says after a careful examination. "Missed the major organs, but there's internal bleeding. I can remove it, stop the hemorrhaging, but he'll need antibiotics and careful monitoring." Shane checks his watch again. 3:15. 38 minutes since the shot that changed everything. In the old world, an ambulance would have arrived by now. Paramedics would have Carl stabilized and en route to a trauma center, with real doctors and proper equipment. This world offers a veterinarian with surgical experience and a kitchen table that smells like antiseptic and fear. "Do it," Shane says. Herschel nods and begins preparing instruments, while the woman from the porch, Maggie, he introduces her as his daughter, assists with the setup. Shane watches them work with the focused attention of someone who's learned that understanding medical procedures might mean the difference between life and death for the people he's sworn to protect. During the surgery, while Carl sleeps under improvised anesthesia and Herschel works to save the boy's life, Shane has his first real conversation with the man who might become either ally or obstacle to his family's survival. "How long you been here?" Shane asks. "Since the beginning. Farm's been in my family for generations. When the world ended, seemed like the right place to wait for it to start again." Herschel's voice carries the particular weariness of someone who's been making impossible decisions for 6 months, while trying to maintain the illusion that normal life might resume if you just hold steady long enough. "You're taking in strays," Shane observes, noting the mixed group of people who clearly didn't start as family, but function like one now. People need places to go. We had space, resources, seemed like the Christian thing to do. Shane thinks about the CDC and Dr. Jenner's revelations about universal infection, about the knowledge that everyone in this peaceful farmhouse is carrying death inside their skulls, that kindness and Christian charity won't change the mathematics of transformation when the time comes. "What do you know about the infection?" Shane asks carefully. Herschel's hands pause in their work for just a moment. "I know that people die and come back different. I know that putting them down quick is kinder than letting them suffer. Beyond that, I try not to think about it too much." It's not the complete understanding that Shane carries, but it's enough to suggest that Herschel isn't operating under dangerous illusions about walker behavior or infection transmission. Shane files this information away for future reference. The surgery takes 2 hours. When it's finished, Carl is unconscious, but stable, breathing steadily with color returning to his face. Herschel strips off surgical gloves with the satisfaction of someone who's successfully completed work that mattered. "He'll need to stay still for at least a week," Herschel says. "Any movement risks tearing the sutures. After that, he should recover completely." Shane feels something tight in his chest loosen for the first time since Carl hit the ground. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Thank me when he's running around causing trouble again." That evening, while Carl sleeps in a bedroom that actually has clean sheets and windows that aren't barred against walkers, Shane sits on Herschel's porch and tries to calculate what this rescue is going to cost. Nothing in this world comes free, and medical care that saves a child's life represents a debt that will need to be paid somehow. Glenn appears on the porch carrying 2 cups of coffee that steam in the cooling evening air. "Figured you might need this." Shane accepts the coffee gratefully, noting that it's real coffee, not the carefully rationed instant they've been living on, but actual ground beans that suggest Herschel's farm has access to resources Shane's group doesn't. "How's your relationship with these people?" Shane asks, Glenn settles into the rocking chair beside Shane's, understanding that the question really means how much can we trust them, and what do they want from us? Good, I think. Maggie's been showing me around, explaining how they've managed to keep the farm running. They've got a system here, rotation for watch duty, organized supply runs, even a garden that's actually producing food. Shane watches Glenn's face as he talks about Maggie, noting the particular expression that suggests the younger man has found something worth his attention beyond simple survival logistics. In other circumstances, Shane might worry about romantic entanglements compromising group security, but Glenn has earned the right to human connection, and if that connection helps integrate Shane's group with Herschel's people, so much the better. What about Herschel's position on outsiders? Complicated, Glenn admits. He wants to help people, but he's also protective of what he's built here. I get the sense that taking us in long-term would require some kind of arrangement that works for everyone. Shane thinks about the conversation he had with Herschel during Carl's surgery, about Christian charity and family traditions, and the way practical people make room for idealism when circumstances permit. Herschel seems like someone who can be reasoned with, but also someone who won't compromise his family's safety for the sake of helping strangers. Before Shane can respond to Glenn's assessment, Laurie appears in the doorway with the particular expression that means something has gone wrong. Sophia's missing, she says simply. Shane checks his watch. 8:43 in the evening. 5 hours since Carl's surgery. 3 hours since the last confirmed sighting of Carol's 12-year-old daughter. In the old world, missing children meant amber alerts and search parties and helicopters with searchlights. In this world, missing children usually means they're already dead, and the only question is whether they'll stay dead. Shane stands up with the automatic response of someone who's learned that every crisis requires immediate action plans. How long? Carol noticed she wasn't at dinner. Nobody's seen her since late afternoon. Shane thinks about the search protocols Rick would have implemented, grid patterns and communication schedules, and careful coordination that maximized coverage while minimizing risk to searchers. Rick would have found a way to mount a rescue operation that gave Sophia the best possible chance while keeping everyone else safe. But Rick isn't here, and Shane's gifts run toward practical leadership rather than hopeful rescue missions. We search until dark, Shane decides. After that, we wait until morning. Can't risk people getting lost in the woods at night. It's the pragmatic choice rather than the optimistic one. The choice that prioritizes the safety of known people over the uncertain fate of someone who might already be beyond help. Shane can see in Laurie's face that she understands the mathematics behind his decision, even if she doesn't like them. The search continues until full darkness makes further effort dangerous. They find no trace of Sophia, no footprints, no torn clothing, no indication of which direction she might have gone or what might have happened to her. Carol sits on Herschel's porch after the searchers return, her face carrying the particular emptiness that comes from learning that hope has a deadline, and the deadline has passed. Dale attempts conversation about tomorrow's search plans, but Carol's attention has turned inward to whatever place people go when the worst thing they can imagine becomes the most likely outcome. Shane sits beside her on the porch steps, understanding that leadership sometimes means sitting with people in their grief rather than trying to fix problems that can't be fixed. We'll start again at first light, he says quietly. Carol nods without looking at him. She's probably already gone. Shane wants to offer false reassurance, wants to insist that 12-year-old girls can survive alone in the woods for extended periods. But Carol's grief deserves honesty rather than comfortable lies. Maybe. But maybe not. Tomorrow we'll know more. Carol finally looks at him, and Shane sees something in her expression that looks like recognition. The acknowledgement that Shane's approach to hope is different from Rick's, but not necessarily wrong. Rick would have found her already, Carol says. Maybe. Rick was good at things I'm not good at. But Rick's not here, and I am, and I'm going to do everything I can to bring your daughter home. It's not the inspiring speech Rick would have delivered, not the passionate commitment to never giving up that would have sent everyone back into the woods with renewed determination. But it's honest, and it's real, and it's the promise of someone who's learned that leadership means doing what you can with the tools you actually have, rather than the tools you wish you possessed. Shane checks his watch one final time. 10:37 at night. In 6 hours they'll resume the search for Sophia, with whatever hope morning might bring. Until then, they wait and plan, and try not to calculate the odds of finding a 12-year-old girl alive in woods full of walkers and dangers that don't announce themselves with moaning or shuffling feet. Carl sleeps safely in Herschel's house, recovering from surgery that saved his life. Sophia remains missing, probably dead, representing the limits of what even the best leadership can protect against. Shane sits between those two realities, the child saved and the child lost, and tries to figure out what tomorrow's version of doing his best might look like. The watch ticks against his wrist, measuring time in a world where time sometimes means the difference between life and death, and sometimes just means the distance between one impossible choice and the next. Chapter 7. The barn. There's a particular sound walkers make when they're contained, but not contained enough. The rhythmic thudding of bodies against wood, over and over, with the persistence of hunger that never sleeps. Shane hears it at dawn while checking the perimeter of Herschel's farm, following the sound to its source, with the methodical attention of someone who's learned that unexplained noises usually mean danger. The barn sits 50 yards from the main house, weathered wood and corrugated metal that speaks to generations of farming before the world ended. From the outside, it looks like any other agricultural building, storage for equipment, feed for livestock, the kind of practical structure that makes farms function. But the sounds coming from inside aren't made by livestock. Shane checks his watch. 6:43 in the morning. Carl's been sleeping peacefully for 5 days since the surgery, color returning to his face and strength building in his voice. Dale's been organizing supplies with the methodical efficiency of someone who's found temporary safety and wants to make it last. Glenn's been spending time with Maggie, learning about sustainable farming and water purification, and all the practical knowledge that comes from people who have managed to build something lasting. And 47 feet away, behind barn doors secured with chains and padlocks, walkers have been collecting like a growing storm that Herschel's been pretending won't eventually break free. Shane counts the sounds. At least 12 distinct impacts, maybe 15. Enough walkers to overrun the farmhouse if they get loose. Enough to kill Carl while he's still recovering from surgery, still vulnerable, and trusting that the adults in his life have eliminated threats before they become threats. What do you do when the people offering you shelter have been keeping secrets that could get everyone killed? When trust becomes a liability and gratitude becomes irrelevant compared to survival mathematics. Shane walks back toward the house with the controlled pace of someone who's made a decision but wants to implement it carefully. He finds Herschel in the kitchen, preparing breakfast with the domestic normalcy of someone who's never stopped believing that routine matters even when the world has ended. "We need to talk," Shane says simply. Herschel looks up from the eggs he's scrambling, reading something in Shane's expression that makes him set down the spatula and give his full attention. What about the walkers in your barn? For just a moment, Herschel's face goes through the progression of someone whose secret has been discovered, and who's calculating how much truth the situation requires. Then his expression settles into the resigned honesty of someone who's been carrying a burden too heavy to hide much longer. They're sick people, Herschel says carefully. My neighbors, my family members, people I've known for 20 years who got infected, but aren't gone. Not completely. Shane thinks about the CDC and Dr. Jenner's brain scans, about frontal cortex death and brainstem function, and the scientific certainty that whatever's walking around in those bodies isn't the people Herschel remembers. But Shane also thinks about Carl, sleeping upstairs in a house 50 yards from a collection of walkers that could break free at any moment. They're walkers, Shane says. Dead people who want to kill living people. And you've been keeping them here while we've been staying in your house, while Carl's been recovering from surgery, while we've been trusting you to keep us safe. Herschel's voice carries the particular defensiveness of someone whose good intentions have been questioned. They're contained, secured. They can't hurt anyone. Chains break, locks fail, wood rots, and when any of those things happen, everyone in this house dies. Shane checks his watch again. 6:49. In 15 minutes, Carl will wake up and ask for breakfast. Laurie will start her morning routine of checking his bandages and monitoring his recovery. Dale will begin planning the day's activities around the comfortable assumption that they're safe here, that Herschel's farm represents a temporary sanctuary from the dangers outside. None of them know that the danger has been inside the perimeter all along. I want them gone, Shane says. Today. Herschel's expression shifts from defensiveness to something harder. This is my land, my family. You don't get to make demands about how I handle my own property. I do when your property threatens my family. The conversation is interrupted by footsteps on the stairs, Carl coming down for breakfast, moving carefully but steadily as his strength returns. Shane watches the boy enter the kitchen with the innocent trust of someone who believes the adults in his life have eliminated all the threats worth worrying about. Carl doesn't know that 15 walkers are chained in the barn, doesn't know that the safety he's been recovering in is built on Herschel's sentimental attachment to people who are already dead, doesn't know that Shane is about to make a choice that will protect Carl's life, but probably destroy any chance of staying on the farm. Morning, Shane. Morning, Mr. Herschel, Carl says, settling at the kitchen table with the careful movements of someone whose abdomen is still healing. Shane looks at Carl and makes the calculation that's been driving every decision he's made since Rick died in that hospital bed. Whatever it costs to keep this boy safe, that cost is acceptable. Whatever relationships have to be sacrificed, whatever trust has to be broken, whatever violence has to be implemented, all of it becomes justified by Carl's continued existence. Carl, I need you to stay inside today, Shane says, close to the house. Don't go wandering around the property. Carl's expression shows the particular attention of someone who's learned to read adult warnings as indicators of real danger. Why? Shane glances at Herschel, giving him one last chance to handle the situation with honesty rather than force. Herschel's silence provides the answer. Because there are some problems on the farm that need solving, and I want to make sure you're safe while we solve them. After Carl finishes breakfast and returns to his room to read, Shane assembles the group in the living room for the conversation that will determine whether they stay or leave, whether they work with Herschel or work around him. Herschel's been keeping walkers in the barn, Shane says, without preamble. At least 15, maybe more. Chained up like pets instead of put down like the threats they are. The reaction is immediate and divided. Dale's face shows understanding mixed with concern, recognition that Herschel's position comes from grief, but also that Shane's concerns are legitimate. Glenn looks toward the stairs where Maggie presumably sleeps, calculating what this revelation means for the relationship he's been building. Laurie's reaction is simpler and more direct. How close to the house? 50 yards. Close enough to smell us. Close enough to break free if the chains fail or the walkers get agitated enough. Carol, who's been sitting quietly since Sophia's disappearance, speaks for the first time in days. Are they all strangers? The walkers in the barn? Shane understands the question behind the question. Carol wants to know if Sophia might be in there, if her missing daughter has been found but transformed into something that wears her face without carrying her gentleness. I don't know, but we're about to find out. The confrontation happens at noon, when the sun is high enough to provide clear visibility, and the day is warm enough that everyone can move without the sluggishness that comes from cold weather. Shane approaches the barn with Glenn and Dale, while Laurie stays in the house with Carl, positioned to evacuate if the situation deteriorates beyond control. Herschel stands between Shane and the barn doors, his face carrying the particular desperation of someone who's about to lose the last connection to a world that made sense. Please, Herschel says, let me show you that they're not dangerous. Let me prove that some part of who they were is still in there. Shane thinks about Rick, about the way Rick would have handled this situation. Rick would have found middle ground, some compromise that respected Herschel's grief while addressing the security concerns. Rick would have asked questions about containment procedures and explored alternatives to immediate elimination. But Rick isn't here, and Shane's priorities are simpler and more focused. Carl's safety comes first, and everything else comes after. Step aside, Shane says. When Herschel doesn't move, Shane steps around him and approaches the barn doors. The chains are newer than the barn itself, recent additions that suggest Herschel's been collecting walkers for months, building a memorial that threatens everyone within range. Shane cuts the chains with bolt cutters borrowed from Herschel's tool shed. The doors swing open, and the walkers begin to emerge with the shuffling determination of hunger finally given direction. They come out one at a time at first, then in clusters as the group mentality takes over. Shane recognizes some faces, neighbors from the surrounding farms, people who probably came to Herschel seeking help and received the kind of help that preserved their bodies while ignoring the fact that their minds were already gone. Shane shoots them systematically, one shot to the head for each walker, with the practiced efficiency of someone who's learned that hesitation in these situations means people die. Dale assists with a rifle, understanding that regardless of his feelings about Herschel's intentions, the immediate threat has to be eliminated. Glenn stands back, his face showing the conflict of someone who's been building relationships with Herschel's family while watching Shane destroy any possibility of peaceful coexistence. The last walker to emerge is smaller than the others, wearing a yellow dress that's torn but recognizable. Sophia, 12 years old and missing for 5 days, shuffles out of the barn with the same aimless hunger as the adults. Carol makes a sound that isn't quite a scream, but carries more pain than any scream could hold. Shane sees Carl appear in the farmhouse doorway, drawn by the gunshots despite instructions to stay inside. The boy watches as Shane raises his pistol toward Sophia, understanding what's about to happen, but not looking away. This is the moment Rick would have shielded Carl from, the image that would have been handled privately while Carl was distracted or removed from the area. But Carl is here, watching as Shane makes the choice that Sophia's death requires. The shot is clean and quick, and Sophia collapses without suffering. Carl's face shows no emotion, but his eyes carry a new understanding about the world they're living in and the choices that survival requires. He's witnessed the practical implementation of love in a world where love sometimes means pulling the trigger. Herschel stands among the bodies of his neighbors and family members, his face carrying the particular devastation of someone whose worldview has been shattered in a way that can't be repaired. "You had no right." "I had every right," Shane responds. "And more importantly, I had the responsibility." The group packs their belongings that afternoon, while Herschel's family watches from the porch with expressions ranging from understanding to hostility. The farm that could have been sanctuary becomes another temporary stop, another burned bridge in the ongoing process of survival. As they load the RV, Dale approaches Shane with the careful attention of someone who needs to say something difficult. "That wasn't how Rick would have handled it," Dale says quietly. Shane checks his watch. 4:37. Time to get moving before Herschel decides that hospitality has limits, and armed groups are no longer welcome on his property. "Rick's not here," Shane says simply, "and Carl is. That's the only calculation that matters." They drive away from Herschel's farm with Carl safe and Sophia buried, and the knowledge that Shane's version of leadership gets results, but at costs that accumulate in ways that might not be sustainable. In the rearview mirror, Shane watches the farmhouse grow smaller until it disappears, taking with it any pretense that this group can afford to prioritize other people's grief over their own survival. The watch ticks against Shane's wrist, measuring distance from choices that can't be undone, counting time in a world where time equals miles between the people they used to be and the people they're becoming. Chapter 8. Winter of Discontent. There's a particular way morning sickness sounds in the quiet hour before dawn, when the world holds its breath and every noise carries farther than it should. Laurie's been fighting nausea for 2 weeks now, thinking it was stress or bad water or something she ate that disagreed with her system. But sitting beside her in the abandoned gas station they've been calling home for the past month, Shane recognizes the rhythm of retching that means their family is about to get more complicated. She emerges from the bathroom, pale but composed, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand and avoiding Shane's eyes with the particular attention of someone who knows a conversation is coming, but isn't ready to have it. "How long?" Shane asks quietly. Laurie sits down on the sleeping bag they've been sharing, her hands moving to her abdomen with the unconscious protectiveness that pregnant women develop before they're even sure they're pregnant. 2 months? Maybe a little more. Shane does the mathematics automatically. 2 months puts conception right around the time they left the CDC, when the world felt like it might be ending and they found comfort in each other's presence. Before Herschel's farm, before the barn, before the group started fracturing along lines that keep getting deeper and more difficult to bridge. The baby is his. Shane knows this with the same certainty. He knows which direction walkers come from when the wind shifts. Laurie's relationship with Rick ended when Rick died in that hospital bed, and everything between her and Shane has been honest and intentional, rather than born from grief or guilt. "How do you feel about it?" Shane asks. Laurie's smile carries the complicated joy that comes from good news delivered in circumstances that make good news complicated. Scared, happy, terrified that we're bringing a child into this world, grateful that we have something to hope for. Shane thinks about Carl, sleeping in the corner of the gas station's back room, surrounded by the books and supplies that represent continuity with the world before. Carl, who's been questioning Shane's decisions more frequently in the week since Sophia's death. Carl, who's been spending more time with Dale and Glenn, seeking perspectives on leadership and morality that Shane can't provide. A baby changes everything, creates new vulnerabilities and new responsibilities and new calculations about risk versus safety. But it also creates something worth fighting for, something that represents a future beyond just surviving until tomorrow. Shane reaches over and places his hand on Laurie's abdomen, feeling nothing yet, but understanding that in a few months there will be movement and heartbeat, and the particular weight that comes from carrying someone else's entire world inside your body. "We'll figure it out," he says simply. The conversation is interrupted by footsteps from the main area of the gas station. Dale, starting his morning routine of checking perimeters and organizing supplies. Shane removes his hand from Laurie's abdomen and checks the time on the digital watch he's been wearing for the past 2 weeks. The sleek, practical timepiece he found in an electronics store and decided was more appropriate for the world they're living in now. Rick's watch sits in Shane's backpack, wrapped in a bandana and stored with other mementos from the world before. He stopped wearing it the day they left Herschel's farm, understanding that carrying Rick's time on his wrist was no longer compatible with making the decisions that keeping everyone alive required. "Morning," Dale says, as Shane emerges from the back room. The older man's voice carries the particular attention of someone who's been thinking about difficult conversations and has decided this is the moment to have one. "Morning. Everything quiet?" "Quiet as death, which is what I wanted to talk to you about." Shane recognizes the tone. It's the voice Dale uses when he's about to challenge decisions he disagrees with, when the carefully maintained surface politeness is about to give way to honest criticism. Shane's been expecting this conversation since they left the farm. Maybe longer. "What's on your mind?" Dale settles into one of the plastic chairs they salvaged from a restaurant, his movements carrying the deliberate care of someone who's about to say things that can't be unsaid. "The way you handled Herschel, the barn, Sophia, all of it." Shane thinks about the 15 walkers he put down in Herschel's barn, about the choice to shoot Sophia rather than let Carol cling to false hope about her daughter's survival, about the practical mathematics that prioritized the safety of known people over the sentimental attachments of people who were offering help. "I handled it the way it needed to be handled." "You handled it like a soldier, like someone who sees problems as things to be eliminated rather than worked around or worked with." Dale's voice carries the patience of someone who's spent 70 years learning that most conflicts can be resolved through conversation if you're willing to invest the time. Shane checks his watch. 7:43. 7. In 15 minutes, Carl will wake up and ask for breakfast. Glenn will start organizing the day's supply run. Andrea will begin cleaning weapons with the methodical attention of someone who's learned that maintenance equals survival. The domestic routine of survival will continue regardless of whether Shane and Dale's resolve their philosophical differences. "Sometimes problems are things that need to be eliminated," Shane says. "Sometimes working around them or working with them gets people killed. And sometimes eliminating them burns bridges you can't afford to burn." Herschel's farm could have been sanctuary for months, maybe longer. We had medical care, sustainable food sources, a community that was willing to work with us. And you threw it away because you couldn't tolerate the old man's grief. Glenn appears from the direction of the gas pumps, moving with the careful attention of someone who's heard raised voices and wants to understand whether the situation requires intervention. His face shows the conflict of someone who's been building relationships with both sides of a growing divide. "Everything okay?" Glenn asks. Dale looks at Glenn with the particular attention of someone who's been hoping for allies and thinks he might have found one. Glenn, you were there. At Herschel's. You saw how things could have gone different. Glenn's discomfort is visible. He's been caught between loyalty to Shane, who's kept the group alive through practical leadership, and recognition that Shane's methods sometimes create more problems than they solve. Herschel was keeping walkers in his barn, Glenn says carefully. That was dangerous, but maybe there was a way to handle it that didn't end with us getting kicked out. Shane sees the alliance forming, Dale's philosophical opposition to harsh methods, finding support in Glenn's desire for diplomatic solutions. It's the beginning of something that could fracture the group beyond repair if it's not managed correctly. Carl appears in the doorway, drawn by the conversation, but not fully awake enough to understand the tensions underneath it. He looks between Shane and Dale with the attention of someone who's learned that adult disagreements often mean changes in routine or safety protocols. Are we arguing? Carl asks, with the direct honesty of a 9-year-old who's tired of adults pretending everything is fine when it obviously isn't. Shane thinks about the baby Laurie's carrying, about the family that's forming in the middle of group dynamics that are becoming more complicated every day, about the responsibility to protect both the people he's already committed to and the person who doesn't exist yet, but will need protection when they do. We're discussing, Shane says, talking through different ways to handle problems. Carl nods, but his expression suggests he understands the difference between discussing and arguing, even if the adults want to use gentler words. Andrea emerges from her watch position near the front windows, moving with the alert attention of someone who's been monitoring both the outside perimeter and the conversation happening inside. Her face shows the particular focus that comes from someone who's decided where her loyalties lie. I heard voices, Andrea says. Thought there might be trouble. Dale turns toward Andrea with the hope of someone looking for another ally and finding instead someone who's already chosen sides. Just talking about leadership styles, about whether there are better ways to handle conflicts than immediate force. Andrea's expression shifts to something harder. Force works. Diplomacy gets people killed. Shane's methods kept us alive when politeness would have gotten us overrun. It's the clearest statement of the philosophical divide that's been growing since they left Herschel's farm. Dale believing that humanity requires maintaining connections and seeking peaceful solutions. Andrea believing that survival requires practical decisions implemented without sentimentality or hesitation. Shane watches the group align itself along ideological lines and thinks about Rick, about the way Rick would have found middle ground that preserved group unity while addressing legitimate concerns on both sides. Rick had a gift for making people feel heard without compromising essential security measures. But Rick isn't here, and Shane's version of leadership is creating divisions that might not be sustainable if they continue to deepen. Glenn looks between Dale and Andrea, his face showing the conflict of someone who sees merit in both positions but recognizes that neutrality is becoming impossible. Maybe we should focus on what we agree on, keeping everyone safe, finding a place to settle down, making sure we have enough supplies. It's an attempt at diplomatic redirection, but Shane can see in everyone's expressions that the fundamental questions won't be avoided much longer. Questions about acceptable risk and necessary violence, and whether maintaining humanity is compatible with ensuring survival. Carl sits down at the table they use for meals and looks at the adults with the particular attention of someone who's learning that the people responsible for his safety don't always agree about what safety requires. Shane, Carl says quietly, are we going to be okay? Shane thinks about the baby Laurie's carrying, about the alliance forming between Dale and Glenn, about Andrea's support for methods that work, but create costs that accumulate in ways he's still learning to calculate, about the watch in his backpack that used to measure time for someone who believed there were always alternatives to the hardest choices. "Yeah, buddy," Shane says. "We're going to be okay." Carl nods, accepting the reassurance with the trust of someone who's learned that adults sometimes have to make difficult decisions, but usually find ways to protect the people they're responsible for. But Shane can see in Dale's expression that the older man isn't satisfied with generic reassurances, that the conversation about leadership methods and group philosophy isn't finished, just postponed until they can have it without Carl listening. The divisions are deepening. The pregnancy changes everything. The group that started as a collection of survivors, held together by shared necessity, is becoming something more complex, a community with competing visions of what community means and what prices are acceptable to pay for security. Shane checks his watch one more time. 7:58. Another day of keeping everyone alive is beginning, and with it, another day of managing conflicts that Rick might have resolved through inspiration and compromise. But Rick's watch is in Shane's backpack now, measuring nothing. And Shane's watch counts time in a world where time equals distance from choices that can't be undone, movement toward decisions that will define what kind of people they become when survival is no longer the only priority that matters. Chapter 9. The Price of Safety. There's a particular way a young man looks when he's tied to a tree and calculating whether the people holding him are the type who kill prisoners or the type who let them go. Randall Culver has that look, 18 years old with soft features that suggest he's never had to make the kind of choices that survival requires, watching Shane pace in front of him with the careful attention of someone trying to read his captor's intentions. They found Randall 3 hours ago, trapped under the wreckage of a motorcycle accident on Highway 85, his leg pinned and his voice hoarse from calling for help. Glenn had wanted to help immediately. The kid looked harmless enough, and leaving people to die went against everything Glenn believed about maintaining humanity in an inhuman world. But Shane had recognized something in Randall's clothing and equipment that suggested affiliation with groups that don't send 18-year-olds on solo missions. "Tell me about your people," Shane says, settling into the camp chair they positioned just out of Randall's reach. The interrogation has been going on for 20 minutes, with answers that feel carefully constructed rather than spontaneously honest. "I told you, there's only a few of us. Maybe 15 people total. We're just trying to survive, same as you." Shane checks his watch. 2:47 in the afternoon. Laurie's napping in the RV, pregnancy fatigue making midday rest necessary. Carl's helping Dale organize supplies, still avoiding extended conversation with Shane since their disagreement about leadership methods last week. The group dynamics that used to center around Shane's authority have shifted into something more complex and less predictable. 15 people don't send armed scouts 20 miles from base camp, Shane says. 15 people hunker down and defend what they have. They don't go looking for other groups to, what, trade with? Or raid? Randall's expression flickers for just a moment, the micro-hesitation that suggests Shane's getting close to information the kid would prefer to keep private. We trade. Find other survivors, share resources, work together. Community building, you know? Dale emerges from the RV, moving with the deliberate pace of someone who's been thinking about moral complexities and has decided this is the moment to address them. Behind him comes Andrea, her face showing the alert attention of someone who's been listening to interrogation techniques and forming opinions about acceptable methods. Shane, Dale says quietly. Can we talk? Shane recognizes the tone. It's the voice Dale uses when he's about to challenge decisions he considers morally questionable, when the carefully maintained surface cooperation is about to give way to philosophical confrontation. In a minute, Kid's about to tell us something useful. Dale looks at Randall, tied to the tree with rope that's tight enough to prevent escape, but not tight enough to cut off circulation. The older man's face shows the particular concern that comes from watching interrogation techniques that edge toward something darker. He's told us he's not a threat. His people are traders, not raiders. What more do we need to know? Shane thinks about the military-grade equipment Randall was carrying, the tactical vest that speaks to organized group operations rather than improvised survival, the radio with frequencies programmed for coordinated communication rather than emergency broadcasts. He's lying, Shane says simply. Question is whether he's lying about numbers, intentions, or both. Glenn appears from his watch position, his face showing the conflict of someone who's been thinking about moral obligations versus security considerations. What if he's telling the truth? What if we're interrogating someone who just needs help? Shane looks around the group that's assembled to witness this conversation, noting the ways individual expressions reveal underlying loyalties. Dale and Glenn showing concern for Randall's well-being. Andrea maintaining professional interest in intelligence gathering. Carl watching from a distance with the attention of someone learning about adult decision-making processes. Then we help him, Shane says. We give him some supplies, point him toward the highway, and send him on his way with directions that take him far from here. And if he's lying? Dale asks. Shane checks his watch again. 2:51. 4 minutes since the last time he looked, which means this conversation is taking longer than efficient information gathering requires. Time spent on moral philosophy is time not spent on practical security measures. If he's lying, then keeping him alive means his people know where to find us. Means they can track us when we move or ambush us if we stay. Means everyone sitting here right now is at risk because we decided to prioritize the life of someone who might be planning to kill us. The group falls silent, processing the implications of Shane's assessment. Around them, the abandoned gas station that's been their home for the past month suddenly feels less secure, less defensible against coordinated assault by people who know their location. Randall speaks up from his position against the tree, his voice carrying the particular desperation of someone who's realized his life depends on convincing skeptical people he's harmless. I swear to you, we're not raiders. We help people. We've taken in families, shared food with strangers. We're good people trying to do good things. Dale's expression shifts toward something approaching hope. See? He's just a kid trying to survive. Same as Carl. Same as any of us. Shane studies Randall's face while the young man makes his plea, reading micro-expressions and vocal patterns for signs of deception. The training from his law enforcement background provides tools for assessment that the others don't have, skills that suggest Randall's story has carefully constructed elements designed to appeal to exactly the kind of humanitarian instincts Dale represents. Dale, Shane says quietly, walk with me. They move away from the group far enough for private conversation, close enough to maintain visual contact with Randall and the others. Dale's face shows the particular attention of someone who's been preparing for this confrontation since they captured the kid. You want to kill him, Dale says without preamble. I want to make the decision that keeps our people alive. If that means killing him, then yes. Dale's voice carries the patience of someone who spent 70 years learning that most conflicts can be resolved through conversation and moral reasoning. Shane, listen to yourself. You're talking about executing a teenager because you think he might be a threat. Not because he is a threat, because he might be. Shane thinks about Laurie, sleeping in the RV with their unborn child growing inside her. About Carl, questioning Shane's methods, but still depending on Shane's protection. About the gas station that represents temporary safety for people who have nowhere else to go. In this world, might be is close enough, Shane says. We can't afford to guess wrong about threats. And we can't afford to become the kind of people who execute teenagers based on suspicion and fear. The philosophical divide that's been growing since Herschel's farm crystallizes into this moment, Dale's commitment to maintaining humanity versus Shane's commitment to ensuring survival. Two different definitions of what protection means and what costs are acceptable to pay for safety. They return to the group where Randall continues to watch faces for signs that his life might be spared. Glenn has been talking to him during Shane and Dale's absence, asking questions about trading routes and resource availability that suggest Glenn's leaning toward believing the kid's story. Here's what I think, Dale announces to the assembled group. We vote. Democratic decision about what to do with Randall. Everyone gets a say. Majority rules. Shane feels something cold settle in his chest. Dale is forcing a confrontation about authority and decision-making that could fracture the group beyond repair. For months, Shane's been making life-and-death choices based on his assessment of threats and opportunities. Now Dale wants to subject those choices to group consensus from people who don't have the training or experience to evaluate security risks accurately. Fine, Shane says. We vote. But when this decision gets people killed, remember that you asked for democracy. The vote is simple and direct. Dale argues for release with supplies and directions away from their location. Shane argues for execution to prevent intelligence about their position from reaching potentially hostile groups. Each member of the group states their position clearly. Dale. Release him. Glenn. Release him. Andrea. Kill him. Laurie. Release him. Carl. I don't think we should kill people unless they're trying to kill us. Shane looks around the group that's just overruled his assessment of threat management by a vote of 4-2. People he's protected, fed, and kept alive for months have decided that their moral comfort matters more than his professional evaluation of security risks. Randall goes free, Dale announces, with the satisfaction of someone who's won a moral victory. We give him supplies and directions, and we wish him well. Shane checks his watch. 3:27. 40 minutes since they started this conversation. 40 minutes of debate about a decision Shane could have made in 40 seconds, with results that prioritized group safety over individual conscience. Randall is released an hour later with food, water, and directions that take him northeast toward Atlanta, and away from the routes the group has been using. Dale personally cuts the ropes and helps the young man to his feet with the gentle attention of someone demonstrating that kindness still matters in a world that punishes kindness. Thank you, Randall says, looking around the group with the gratitude of someone who's been given his life back by strangers. I won't forget this. If you ever need anything, if you're ever in trouble, you find me and mine. We take care of people who take care of us. Shane watches Randall disappear into the tree line and calculates timelines. If the kid's telling the truth about his group's composition and location, they'll have visitors within 3 days. If he's lying about being harmless traders, they'll have raiders within 3 days. Either way, the decision to release him has started a clock that counts down to consequences Shane can't control. Carl approaches Shane after Randall is gone, his face showing the particular expression of someone who's been thinking about complex moral questions and wants adult guidance in understanding them. Did we do the right thing? Carl asks. Shane thinks about the vote that overruled his judgment, about the group democracy that prioritizes collective conscience over individual expertise, about the ways Rick would have handled this situation, finding middle ground that preserved both moral integrity and practical security. But Rick isn't here to provide those solutions, and Shane's version of leadership has just been subordinated to group consensus by people who will expect him to protect them from the consequences of decisions they made against his advice. "I don't know," Shane tells Carl honestly. "Ask me in 3 days." 2 days later, the attack comes. Shane wakes to the sound of vehicles approaching the gas station from multiple directions, coordinated assault that suggests professional planning and superior numbers. Through the windows, he can see at least 8 people moving with tactical precision toward positions that will provide overlapping fields of fire. "Everyone up," Shane calls quietly, reaching for the weapons cache they keep ready for exactly this scenario. "We've got company." Dale emerges from his sleeping area with the confusion of someone who's been awakened by crisis and needs time to process what's happening. Glenn moves immediately to defensive positions, with the automatic response of someone who's learned that unexpected visitors usually mean danger. The attack lasts 15 minutes. When it's over, the gas station is riddled with bullet holes, and the group has lost their temporary sanctuary. They escape with their lives, but nothing else. Supplies, medical equipment, and the sense of security that comes from having a defensible position all abandoned in the rush to avoid being overrun. As they flee through the woods, carrying only what they could grab during the evacuation, Dale approaches Shane with the expression of someone who's been forced to acknowledge uncomfortable realities. "You were right," Dale says quietly. "About Randall. About the threat." Shane checks his watch, the practical digital timepiece that counts time in a world where time equals distance from choices that can't be undone. "Yeah," he says simply. "I was." But being right doesn't feel like victory when being right means people nearly died because group consensus overruled professional judgment about threat assessment. Shane looks back toward the gas station that represented temporary safety and thinks about the costs of democracy, when democracy means uninformed people make life and death decisions based on moral preferences rather than tactical realities. Carl walks beside Shane through the woods, his face showing the particular attention of someone who's learning that good intentions and moral righteousness don't always produce good outcomes. That sometimes the harsh choices are harsh because the alternatives are worse. The group moves forward into uncertainty, carrying the knowledge that Shane's leadership has been subordinated to collective decision-making, and collective decision-making has nearly gotten them killed. The watch ticks against Shane's wrist, measuring time in a world where time means distance from the consequences of choices made by people who won't have to implement the solutions their choices require. Chapter 10. Governor's Gambit. There's a particular silence that happens when people you're responsible for don't return from a routine mission. Not the quiet of early morning or the stillness of afternoon rest, but the charged absence that fills the space where familiar voices should be checking in with updates about supplies found and routes taken and estimated time of return. Glenn and Maggie have been gone 18 hours from what should have been an 8-hour run to the pharmacy in Woodbury. Shane checks his watch for the 7th time in 10 minutes, calculating distances and contingencies and the probability that 2 experienced scavengers have simply been delayed by walker herds or vehicle problems rather than captured by hostile groups who don't advertise their presence until it's too late to avoid them. 4:37 in the afternoon. The sun is already starting its descent toward evening, and with it comes the hard deadline that determines whether this is a rescue mission or a recovery mission. Search and rescue in daylight with reasonable chances of success. Body recovery in darkness with reasonable chances of joining the casualties. They should have been back by noon, Dale says, settling beside Shane on the concrete steps of the warehouse they've been using as temporary shelter since the gas station raid. The older man's voice carries the particular weight of someone who's been thinking about worst-case scenarios and hoping someone else will articulate more optimistic alternatives. Shane thinks about the conversation he had with Glenn before the supply run. Standard protocols about radio check-ins and fallback routes, and the importance of prioritizing escape over supplies if situations deteriorated beyond acceptable risk levels. Glenn had nodded with the serious attention of someone who'd run successful missions before and understood that overconfidence could get people killed. But understanding protocols and being able to implement them when ambushed by superior numbers are different skills, and Shane's beginning to suspect that Glenn and Maggie have encountered the kind of situation that makes protocols irrelevant. Woodbury's a small town, Shane says, more to himself than to Dale. Handful of buildings, clear sight lines, easy in and out. Nothing that should take 18 hours to navigate. Andrea approaches from her watch position on the warehouse roof, moving with the alert attention of someone who's been scanning horizons and wants to report what she's seen. Her face shows the focused expression that comes from spotting something significant in the distance. Vehicle approaching from the east, Andrea announces. Single rider on motorcycle, moving fast, but not like they're running from walkers. Shane stands up with the automatic response of someone who's learned that unexpected visitors require immediate assessment of threat versus opportunity. In the distance, he can make out the shape of a motorcycle approaching their position with purposeful direction rather than random travel. The rider who pulls up to the warehouse entrance is someone Shane's never seen before. A woman in her 30s, with the particular bearing that comes from extended survival in hostile territory. She's armed but not threatening, alert but not panicked. Most importantly, she's alone, which suggests either confidence in her abilities or desperation that outweighs reasonable caution. "You Shane Walsh?" the woman asks, removing her helmet to reveal short-cropped hair and eyes that suggest she's seen things that would break most people. Shane recognizes the tone. It's the voice of someone who's been looking for specific people and believes she's found them, which means either Glenn and Maggie sent her, or someone else wants Shane's group found for reasons that probably aren't friendly. Depends who's asking and why they want to know. The woman extends her hand with the directness of someone who's learned that formal introductions matter when you're asking strangers for help. "Michonne, and I'm asking because your people are in trouble and you're going to need all the help you can get if you want them back alive." Shane feels something cold settle in his chest, the confirmation that Glenn and Maggie aren't delayed by routine complications, but captured by organized hostiles who now know about Shane's group and their temporary location. What kind of trouble? Michonne glances around the warehouse perimeter, noting positions and sight lines with the automatic assessment of someone who's learned to evaluate defensive positions quickly. The kind that comes from a man who calls himself the governor and thinks other people's lives belong to him. Shane thinks about Rick, about the way Rick would have handled this situation. Rick would have asked careful questions about Michonne's background and motivations, would have established trust gradually while gathering intelligence about the threat they're facing, would have found diplomatic solutions that minimized casualties while maximizing information. But Shane's gifts run toward tactical assessment rather than diplomatic negotiation, and Michonne's arrival has started a clock that counts down to decisions that need to be made quickly rather than carefully. "Tell me what happened," Shane says. Michonne settles against the warehouse wall with the efficient movements of someone conserving energy while delivering essential information. Your people walked into Woodbury yesterday afternoon. Town's been taken over by a group calling themselves Peaceful Survivors. But they're raiders with good PR. The governor keeps prisoners for entertainment and leverage. Shane checks his watch. 4:44. Sunset in less than 3 hours, which means any rescue attempt needs to begin soon or wait until tomorrow morning. Waiting means Glenn and Maggie spend another night as prisoners of people who consider captivity a form of entertainment. How many? 40, maybe 50. Well armed, organized. They've got vehicles, walls, enough firepower to handle most threats. But they're used to dealing with desperate people and unprepared groups, not with people who know how to fight back effectively. Dale approaches the conversation with the careful attention of someone who's been listening to tactical planning and wants to contribute perspective about risk versus reward. Shane, this sounds like the kind of situation where we should consider negotiation before violence. Shane thinks about the 18 hours Glenn and Maggie have been missing, about the kinds of things organized raiders do to prisoners during 18 hours of captivity, about Laurie sleeping in the warehouse with their unborn child, depending on Shane's judgment to keep them safe while also bringing home the people who've become family. They've had our people for 18 hours, Shane says to Dale. If negotiation was going to work, it would have worked already. Michonne nods with the recognition of someone who's seen the governor's version of diplomacy. He doesn't negotiate. He takes what he wants and keeps what he takes. Your people are leverage now, insurance against groups like yours causing trouble for his operation. Andrea joins the conversation, her face showing the alert attention of someone who's been thinking about tactical considerations. What kind of defenses are we talking about? Walls, guard towers, overlapping fields of fire, but also routines, patrol schedules, weak points that someone with inside knowledge can exploit. Shane studies Michonne's face, reading the micro-expressions that reveal motivation and reliability. She's offering specific intelligence about defensive positions, which suggests either extensive surveillance or inside access. Either way, it represents information that could make the difference between successful rescue and catastrophic failure. Why are you helping us? Michonne's expression hardens into something that speaks to personal grievances that run deeper than stranger assistance. Because the governor has something that belongs to me, and because one person can't take down 40, but 5 people with the right plan might be able to. Shane feels the calculation shift in his favor. Michonne isn't offering charity or humanitarian assistance. She's proposing tactical alliance for mutual benefit, which means her intelligence is motivated by self-interest rather than altruism. That makes it more reliable and more actionable. What's the plan? Direct assault on the weakest section of perimeter. Fast, violent, overwhelming. Get in. Get your people. Get out before they can organize coordinated response. It's exactly the approach Shane would have chosen. Rick would have looked for infiltration routes and extraction strategies that minimized casualties on both sides, would have tried to find ways to rescue Glenn and Maggie without permanently escalating conflict with the governor's people. But Rick isn't here. And Shane's version of rescue operations prioritizes getting his people out alive over maintaining diplomatic relationships with raiders who consider captivity entertainment. When do we leave? Now, before they move your people to more secure locations or decide they're more trouble than they're worth. Shane checks his watch one final time. 4:53. Enough daylight for a direct assault, but not enough for careful reconnaissance or elaborate planning. The kind of time constraint that forces practical decisions over perfect decisions. Dale's face shows concern about the speed of Shane's commitment to violent solutions. Shane, shouldn't we consider alternatives? Maybe there's a way to get them back without starting a war. Shane thinks about Glenn, who's kept everyone fed through supply runs that required more courage than anyone should have to demonstrate regularly. About Maggie, who represents hope for something beyond mere survival. About the 18 hours they've been prisoners of people who consider captivity a form of control. There is no alternative, Shane says simply. We get them back, or we lose them forever. Those are the only two options that matter. The assault team consists of Shane, Andrea, and Michonne, 3 people with military or law enforcement backgrounds moving against fortified positions defended by superior numbers, the kind of tactical mathematics that suggests either complete surprise or complete disaster, with very little middle ground. They approach Woodbury as the sun touches the horizon, using farm equipment and abandoned buildings for cover, while Michonne identifies guard positions and patrol patterns. The town looks peaceful from the outside, well-maintained buildings, organized perimeter, the appearance of successful community building in a world where success usually means something temporary and desperate. But Shane can see the signs that suggest organized predation rather than sustainable survival. Too many weapons for a purely defensive community. Too many vehicles for a group that stays in one location. Too much comfort for people who should be struggling with the same resource limitations that affect everyone else. The governor's people have been taking what they need from other groups rather than producing it themselves. The assault begins at sunset, with concentrated fire on the guard towers and main gate. Shane's military training provides tactical frameworks that turn 3 people into effective assault force, overlapping fields of fire, coordinated movement, the kind of professional violence that overwhelms amateur defenders who aren't prepared for coordinated attack. They find Glenn and Maggie in the building the governor uses for prisoner interrogation, alive but showing signs of the kind of treatment that makes Shane's decision to use overwhelming force feel justified rather than excessive. The extraction takes 12 minutes from initial assault to vehicle escape. When it's over, Woodbury's defenses are compromised, and the governor's reputation for invincibility is damaged. But Glenn and Maggie are safe, and the group has gained an ally whose knowledge of regional threats makes future survival more likely. As they drive away from Woodbury with Glenn and Maggie recovered and Michonne integrated into their group, Shane checks his watch for the distance they've traveled from choices that can't be undone. Another problem solved through direct action rather than diplomatic negotiation. Another situation where Rick's approach would have been more complicated and probably less effective. But also another bridge burned with people who might have become allies under different circumstances. Another relationship destroyed in service of protecting the people Shane's committed to keeping alive. The watch ticks against Shane's wrist, measuring time in a world where time equals distance from the governor they've just made an enemy of, and the war that decision has probably started. Chapter 11. War without strategy. There's a particular sound concrete makes when high-caliber rounds impact it repeatedly. Sharp cracks, followed by the patter of debris, falling like deadly rain. Shane crouches behind the reinforced wall of what used to be the Georgia Diagnostic and Classification Prison, listening to the governor's forces probe their defenses with systematic precision that suggests professional military training rather than improvised raider tactics. The prison wasn't supposed to be a fortress. When they'd found it 3 weeks ago, Shane had seen potential sanctuary. High walls, defensible positions, enough space for the group to spread out and establish something approaching normal life. But the governor's retaliation for the Woodbury assault had arrived faster than Shane anticipated, and sanctuary became siege position before they'd finished clearing the cell blocks of walkers. Shane checks his watch. 11:47 in the morning. Day 3 of continuous harassment by governor forces who probe defenses, withdraw when met with resistance, and return with different tactics and better intelligence about weak points. It's psychological warfare designed to exhaust defenders and create opportunities for decisive assault when the people inside are too tired to respond effectively. But Shane isn't fighting a psychological war. He's fighting a military campaign against an enemy who made the mistake of taking his people and now faces the consequences of that choice. The governor wants to break morale and force surrender. Shane wants to eliminate the threat permanently and is prepared to sacrifice whatever resources that elimination requires. Movement on the south wall, Carl reports from his position in the guard tower, his voice carrying the focused attention of someone who's learned to spot threats before they become critical. At 10 years old, Carl has become the group's most effective spotter, small enough to move through defensive positions quickly and observant enough to notice patterns that adults might miss. Shane thinks about Rick, about the way Rick would have handled Carl's involvement in active combat operations. Rick would have found ways to keep the boy safe and protected, would have insisted on maintaining childhood innocence even in the middle of warfare. But Rick isn't here, and Shane needs every advantage available to keep the group alive against superior numbers and coordinated assault. "How many?" Shane calls back. 6, maybe 8. Moving in formation, staying behind cover. They're testing response times again. Shane nods to Andrea and Michonne, who've positioned themselves at overlapping angles that provide crossfire on the approach routes the governor's forces have been using. The 3 of them have developed tactical coordination that turns limited manpower into effective defense. But defense has limitations when the enemy controls timing and can choose when to escalate beyond harassment into full assault. "Let them come in close," Shane instructs. "We show them what coordinated fire looks like." The engagement lasts 4 minutes and ends with governor forces retreating after taking casualties they can't afford to absorb in extended siege operations. Shane watches them withdraw through prison binoculars, counting personnel and equipment while calculating the mathematics of attrition warfare. The governor has more people, but Shane's group has better positions and more motivation. Eventually, the numbers have to favor the defenders if the defenders can maintain discipline and prevent breakthrough. Dale emerges from the cell block they've been using as medical station, his face showing the particular expression of someone who's been dealing with problems that can't be solved through tactical planning. Behind him comes Glenn, moving carefully but steadily as he recovers from injuries sustained during the Woodbury captivity. "Laurie needs to see you," Dale says quietly. "Now." Shane feels something cold settle in his chest. Laurie's been showing signs of labor complications for the past 24 hours. Elevated blood pressure, irregular contractions, the kind of symptoms that require medical intervention they can't provide in a concrete cell block under active siege. The timing couldn't be worse for bringing new life into a world where existing life is under constant threat. "How bad?" Dale's expression provides the answer before his words do. "Bad enough that we need to make decisions about priorities. Medical evacuation versus defensive positions. Laurie's health versus group security." Shane thinks about the calculations that have driven every decision he's made since Rick died in that hospital bed. Whatever it costs to keep his family alive, that cost is acceptable. Whatever tactical advantages have to be sacrificed, whatever defensive positions have to be abandoned, all of it becomes irrelevant compared to Laurie's survival and the survival of the child she's carrying. "Carl," Shane calls to the guard tower. "Down here. Now." Carl appears with the quick efficiency of someone who's learned that urgent summons usually mean important conversations about changes in situation or safety protocols. His face shows the alert attention of someone who's spent 3 days in active combat zone and understands that every decision carries life and death consequences. "Dad sick?" Carl asks, using the word that's become natural over the months since Shane stepped into the role that circumstances required. Shane settles into squad leader mode, the voice he uses when delivering mission parameters to people who need clear instructions without emotional complexity. "Laurie's having complications with the baby. We need to get her medical care, which means leaving the prison and finding a place with surgical equipment." Carl's expression shifts through understanding and concern. "The governor's people will follow us." It's the tactical assessment Shane would expect from someone who's spent 3 days learning about siege warfare and enemy capabilities. Carl has become a soldier in ways that Rick would never have permitted, processing combat situations with clarity that most adults can't achieve. "Yeah, they'll follow us, so we need to move fast and smart, and we need everyone ready for combat operations during evacuation." Andrea approaches the conversation with weapons and equipment already prepared for rapid movement. "Where are we going?" Shane thinks about the intelligence Michonne has gathered about regional medical facilities. Hospital 20 miles east has surgical suites that might still have power. Getting there means fighting through governor forces and establishing defensive perimeter long enough for medical procedures. Michonne nods with the recognition of someone who's seen similar tactical situations. That's not extraction. That's assault with medical objectives. Which is why everyone needs to be ready for sustained combat operations, including Carl. Dale's expression shows concern about involving a 10-year-old in combat assault operations. "Shane, there has to be another way. Something that doesn't require Carl to—" "There is no other way," Shane interrupts. "We don't have enough people to maintain defensive positions and provide escort security. Everyone who can handle a weapon needs to handle a weapon. That includes Carl." Carl's face shows the particular seriousness that comes from understanding adult responsibilities have been transferred to him earlier than anyone would prefer. "I'm ready." The evacuation begins at noon, with Laurie loaded into the RV and surrounded by mobile defensive positions that can respond to ambush attempts during movement to the hospital. Shane has organized the group into fire teams with overlapping responsibilities: advance reconnaissance, flank security, rear guard protection. Professional military tactics applied to survival situation that requires professional responses. The governor's forces attack during the 3rd mile of movement, using coordinated assault from multiple directions that suggests advance planning based on intelligence about evacuation routes. Shane's response is immediate and overwhelming, concentrated firepower that breaks the initial assault and creates opportunity for continued movement toward medical objectives. Carl performs his role with the focused efficiency of someone who's learned that hesitation in combat situations gets people killed. He handles communications between fire teams, maintains ammunition counts, and provides covering fire that allows adults to maneuver without exposing flanks to enemy assault. Professional soldiering from someone who should be learning multiplication tables rather than squad tactics. The hospital compound is partially overrun with walkers, which means clearing operations while maintaining defensive perimeter against governor forces who've followed the evacuation convoy. Shane coordinates simultaneous assault against walker infestation and human threats, using techniques that turn multiple enemy situations into manageable tactical problems. Laurie's emergency surgery takes place in a hospital operating room, while gunfire echoes from the corridors outside. Dale assists with medical procedures, while Shane coordinates defense against governor forces attempting to breach hospital perimeter. The ultimate test of leadership priorities, protecting the family member in medical crisis while maintaining tactical command of combat operations. The surgery lasts 2 hours, When it's finished, Laurie is stable and the baby is healthy, but the hospital is no longer defensible against renewed governor assault. The group evacuates with their newest member, a daughter who enters the world during active combat operations rather than the peace and safety that new life deserves. As they drive away from the hospital, with Laurie recovering and the baby nursing successfully, Shane thinks about the choices that brought them to this moment. Rick would have found diplomatic solutions that avoided open warfare, would have protected Carl from combat involvement, and found medical alternatives that didn't require assault operations. But Rick isn't here, and Shane's version of leadership has kept everyone alive through military tactics that work, even when they cost more than anyone should have to pay. Carl sits beside the baby, his face showing the particular attention of someone who's learned that protection requires constant vigilance. He's carrying a rifle across his lap with the casual familiarity that comes from sustained combat operations. Professional soldier at 10 years old, childhood sacrificed for the survival advantages that professional soldiering provides. "What do we do now?" Carl asks. Shane checks his watch. 4:37 in the afternoon. They've successfully completed medical evacuation under hostile fire and maintained group cohesion through sustained combat operations. But they've also lost their defensive position and made an enemy who won't stop until one side or the other no longer exists. "Now we find somewhere the governor can't reach us," Shane says. "Somewhere we can raise your sister without fighting for her life every day." But Shane knows the truth that Carl is too young to understand yet. In this world, there is nowhere the governor can't reach determined enough people who want revenge more than they want safety. The war has started, and it won't end until someone stops being capable of continuing it. The watch ticks against Shane's wrist, measuring time in a world where time equals distance from the hospital where his daughter was born under gunfire, and toward whatever final confrontation will determine whether his family survives the war. He started by refusing to let anyone take what belongs to him. Carl holds his rifle and watches the baby sleep, learning that love sometimes means being prepared to kill for the people who matter most. Professional soldier and protective brother, carrying responsibilities no 10-year-old should carry, but carrying them with competence that keeps everyone alive. The RV moves toward whatever sanctuary might be possible for people who've chosen war over surrender, family over diplomacy, survival over everything else that used to matter when the world made different kinds of sense. Chapter 12. The weight of the badge. There's a particular way a man moves when he knows he's walking toward death, but has made peace with the mathematics of survival that require someone to pay the final price. Shane Walsh approaches the abandoned factory where the governor has agreed to meet for what both men understand will be their last conversation. Carrying weapons and the weight of every decision that's brought him to this moment where diplomacy ends and only force remains. The meeting was the governor's idea, a final negotiation before what he called unfortunate escalation that serves no one's interests. Shane accepted because ending this war requires facing the person who started it, and because some conversations can only happen between the people whose choices created consequences that affect everyone around them. Shane checks his watch out of habit, then notices the face has cracked during the hospital assault. The digital display flickers between accurate time and random numbers, broken like everything else from the world, before that's been asked to function in circumstances it was never designed to handle. He almost throws it away, then decides to keep it as a reminder that some things break under pressure and some things adapt. 4:27 in the afternoon, according to the damaged display. Or possibly 8:53. Time has become fluid in a world where survival makes its own schedule. The governor waits inside the factory with 3 of his people positioned at strategic angles, enough backup to handle treachery, but few enough to suggest this might actually be conversation rather than ambush. He's a man in his 40s with the particular bearing that comes from someone who's learned to control people through combining charm with the credible threat of violence. "Shane Walsh," the governor says, extending his hand with the practiced warmth of someone who's spent months perfecting the appearance of reasonable leadership. "Philip Blake, though most people just call me Governor." Shane recognizes the performance. It's the same political theater he's seen from sheriffs and mayors who confuse titles with authority and assume that formal politeness can disguise fundamental disagreements about power and territory. "You wanted to talk," Shane says simply. "Talk." The governor settles into one of the metal chairs that suggest this factory was set up specifically for meetings rather than discovered as convenient neutral ground. "I think there's been a misunderstanding about intentions and territorial boundaries. My people and your people don't need to be in conflict." Shane studies the governor's face while he delivers what sounds like a prepared speech about mutual benefit and resource sharing. The man is skilled at projecting sincerity, while his eyes calculate advantages and his body language suggests readiness for violence if conversation doesn't produce the outcomes he prefers. It's exactly the kind of sophisticated manipulation Rick would have tried to counter through patient diplomacy and careful relationship building. Rick would have looked for common ground and shared interests that could provide foundation for peaceful coexistence. But Shane isn't here to build relationships. He's here to eliminate a threat that's endangered his family and will continue endangering them until one side or the other stops being capable of fighting. "You took my people," Shane says, "held them prisoner, used them for entertainment. Then you followed us to our shelter and tried to take everyone else." The governor's expression shifts slightly, revealing calculation underneath the diplomatic exterior. Unfortunate misunderstandings that escalated beyond what anyone intended. But that's history now. The question is whether we choose cooperation or continued conflict. Shane thinks about Glenn and Maggie, showing signs of the kind of treatment that leaves psychological scars alongside physical ones. About Carl, learning to handle weapons and tactical communications at 10 years old, because Shane needs every advantage available against organized enemies. About Laurie, giving birth during active combat because there was nowhere safe to bring new life into a world where safety is temporary at best. "The answer is continued conflict," Shane says. The governor's mask slips for just a moment, revealing the predator underneath the politician. "That's unfortunate. I was hoping we could reach accommodation that served everyone's interests." "Your interests include taking things that belong to other people. My interests include keeping you from taking anything that belongs to me." The conversation deteriorates quickly after that. The governor attempts psychological manipulation, threats disguised as warnings, bribes disguised as generous offers, the kind of sophisticated control techniques that work on people who believe negotiation is always preferable to violence. Shane responds to manipulation attempts with direct statements about consequences and timelines. When the governor threatens to return with superior numbers, Shane explains that superior numbers won't help if the governor isn't alive to command them. When the governor offers resource sharing in exchange for territorial concessions, Shane clarifies that his territory extends as far as necessary to protect his family, and the governor's territory is wherever Shane decides the governor is allowed to exist. It's not diplomacy. It's the kind of honest conversation that happens when someone who understands violence meets someone who's become dependent on psychological manipulation to achieve goals that violence could accomplish more efficiently. The meeting ends when the governor realizes that Shane can't be threatened, bribed, or convinced to accept arrangements that leave threats to Shane's family unresolved. The final assault happens at sunset, with both sides understanding that only one leader will be walking away from whatever confrontation settles the territorial dispute permanently. Shane's approach to the final battle reflects everything he's learned about leadership in a world where leadership means keeping people alive, regardless of what keeping them alive requires. No elaborate strategy that depends on enemy cooperation. No complex plans that fall apart when circumstances change. Just superior firepower applied with professional precision until the threat stops being a threat. The governor dies during the assault on his final position, not through dramatic confrontation or ideological debate, but through tactical coordination that overwhelms his defenses before he can implement escape plans or call for reinforcements. Shane doesn't deliver speeches about justice or motivation. He simply removes an obstacle to his family's survival with the efficient violence that obstacles require. But victory comes at costs that Rick might have avoided through different approaches. Dale dies during the assault, caught in crossfire while trying to provide medical assistance rather than combat support. Glenn takes injuries that will limit his mobility for months. Andrea sustains wounds that might have permanent consequences for her ability to function as the group's primary marksman. 3 people who might have survived if Shane had found diplomatic alternatives to military solutions. 3 losses that Rick's approach might have prevented through patient negotiation and careful relationship building. Shane sits beside Dale's body after the fighting ends, understanding that leadership in this world requires accepting responsibility for deaths that different choices might have prevented. Dale, who believed maintaining humanity was worth dying for. Dale, who argued for mercy and democratic decision-making until the end. Carl approaches Shane, while Shane processes the costs of keeping everyone else alive. The boy moves with the steady confidence of someone who's learned to function effectively in combat situations, carrying his rifle with casual familiarity that speaks to weeks of sustained warfare. "Dad," Carl says, using the title that's become natural during months of shared survival. "We won." Shane looks at Carl, 10 years old and professionally capable with weapons, childhood sacrificed for the tactical advantages that childhood sacrifice provides. In another timeline, Rick would have found ways to protect Carl from combat involvement, would have preserved innocence and optimism even in the middle of warfare. But in this timeline, Carl's military training kept him alive during sustained combat operations. His ability to function as soldier, rather than protected child, contributed to tactical success that eliminated threats to everyone's survival. "Yeah," Shane says, "we won." Carl studies Shane's expression with the attention of someone who's learned to read adult emotions for signs of changes in safety or security protocols. "You okay with what it cost?" It's the kind of question Rick would have answered with reassurance about moral complexity and necessary choices. Rick would have found ways to frame victory as vindication of humanitarian values rather than acknowledgement that violence sometimes works better than alternatives. Shane thinks about the broken watch on his wrist, displaying random numbers that have nothing to do with actual time. Like everything else from the world before, it's been asked to function in circumstances it was never designed to handle, and it's broken under pressure that exceeded its design parameters. "I'm okay with keeping you and your mum and your sister alive," Shane says honestly. "Everything else is secondary to that." Carl nods with the understanding of someone who's learned that survival requires prioritizing some values over others. Rick would have done it different. Rick would have tried to save everyone. Rick was a better man than I am. Carl considers this assessment for a moment, before responding with the directness that's become his default, since learning that adult conversations often determine life-and-death outcomes. But Rick's not here, and we are, and the governor's not going to hurt anyone else. Shane looks around the battlefield, where his approach to leadership has eliminated threats through sustained application of professional violence. Dale's body represents the cost of choosing warfare over diplomacy. Glenn's injuries represent the price of prioritizing decisive action over careful planning. Andrea's wounds represent the consequences of accepting losses to achieve victory. But Carl, Laurie, and their newborn daughter are alive and safe. The group has sanctuary that won't be threatened by organized enemies who consider other people's lives entertainment. The war is over because one side no longer exists to continue fighting. Laurie appears through the smoke carrying the baby, moving carefully through debris while scanning for remaining threats. Her face shows the strain of weeks under siege and the particular exhaustion that comes from new motherhood during sustained combat operations. When she reaches Shane, she settles beside him with the natural ease of someone who's learned to love through shared survival rather than shared romance. It's partnership forged through crisis management and tactical coordination, the kind of relationship that develops when two people discover they work well together under pressure, and they care about the same things enough to sacrifice everything else for those shared priorities. "It's finished?" Laurie asks. Shane looks at his broken watch one more time before pulling it off his wrist and setting it aside. The digital display continues flickering between meaningless numbers, measuring time that doesn't exist for people who've learned to live according to schedules that survival determines. "It's finished," Shane confirms. The watch ticks against the concrete beside Dale's body. Broken technology trying to measure time according to old-world parameters in a new world where time means something completely different. Like morality and leadership and family, time has been redefined by circumstances that required adaptation rather than preservation. Shane Walsh, who used to be a deputy in a place that doesn't exist anymore, has become exactly what this world demanded. Someone capable of making choices Rick couldn't make, paying prices Rick wouldn't pay, accepting costs Rick wouldn't accept. Not better or worse than Rick, but different in ways that this world required. Carl sits between Shane and Laurie, holding his rifle and watching the baby sleep. Professional soldier and protective brother, carrying responsibilities that 10-year-olds shouldn't carry, but carrying them with competence that keeps everyone alive. The family that formed through shared survival, rather than shared genetics, settles into whatever peace is possible for people who've chosen each other through crisis and discovered that choosing each other is enough foundation for building something worth protecting. The broken watch measures nothing beside Dale's body, its display flickering through random numbers like the broken concept of time, in a world where time has been redefined by the necessities of keeping the people you love alive, regardless of what keeping them alive requires from the person you used to be. Shane's transformation is complete. The deputy who worried about his friend's well-being is gone, replaced by someone who can eliminate threats without hesitation, accept losses without paralysis, and build family from the people who survive the process of choosing survival over everything else the old world taught them to value. Still breathing, still protecting, still choosing the people who matter over the principles that don't work when principles become obstacles to the survival of people who depend on you to make impossible choices with steady hands and clear judgment. The weight of Rick's badge is gone. In its place is the weight of choices that Rick never had to make, carried by someone Rick never had to become, accepted by family that Rick never had to build from the remains of everything that ended, when the world required different definitions of love and protection, and the prices both are worth paying.